Welcome back to the Orthodox Ethos. We're glad you're joining us tonight. We're very glad to have our good friend and co-worker in many ways, Patrick Craig Truglia, back to the Orthodox Ethos podcast, this time as one of our authors, Uncut Mountain Press authors, to talk about the new book just came out. Very long-awaited and exciting book, The Rise and Fall of the Papacy. Stay tuned for a very interesting conversation. Greg, Patrick, good to see you. Glad to be back on Orthodox Ethos.
It's good to be here. Thank you, Father.
Thanks for joining us. We're really excited about your book launch this week. It's been going great, selling very well. And it really dovetails well with our announcement of the upcoming conference, which you are going to be speaking at as well. We're also going to talk about that tonight, the upcoming conference on the Eighth Oecumenical Council, which will be addressing aspects that are touched upon in your book as well. But first, we're going to talk and address the new book, try to help folks out there to be introduced to it and to go deeper in why, first and foremost, why was it necessary? Why is it necessary to write the book, to read the book? And how is it going to help a lot of people on the path of salvation? For this is what everything we're doing here, at least at Orthodox Ethos, we're trying to make it dovetail with the whole economy of salvation for each one of us. So we're looking forward to diving a little bit deeper for those out there who may be not sure, should I buy the book? Is the book for me? But also, even if they're just getting introduced to the topic, there's a lot of material here. I think somebody had mentioned in the live stream, I'm so glad to have found Orthodox Ethos because I want to learn more about my faith. And I said, well, this is the place to be. But tonight we're going to go very interesting and very deep in church history and ecclesiology. So for those of you who don't know anything about the book, let me just give you a little just on the screen, flash the cover, and there you go. There it is, Rise and Fall of the Papacy. It's out from Uncut Mountain Press. I'm waiting for the ebook to be sent to me because I didn't have it handy, and that is also available through Uncut Mountain Press. Also, the print book, which you can go, and we'll put that on the screen shortly. But it is not a small book. It is almost 400 pages. We've got about 9 chapters with introduction, so 10 chapters. And but I'm gonna let Patrick introduce the book. First of all, just tell us a little about the book, and then tell us, why did you write the book? That's one of my first questions.
Well, I don't know. I would like to know whether we could put that cover back on screen, because
yes,
sometimes you can't judge a book by its cover, but in this instance, I take it as a compliment. It's a beautiful cover to the book.
Yeah, let me see if I can get it so it's not over our faces, because that's not very professional.
Well, at least my face up, Father.
Yeah. So the book is fantastic, and not just the cover, but I think you're right. The cover is fantastic. We're really happy with the cover. We need to get the back cover. We need to get the back cover so I can show people the back cover, which is also very interesting. Let me actually get the web page up here, and that'll be the best way to go about that. Hang on a second.
Yeah, so like when Father's doing that, you mentioned why I wrote the book. And the book is really, in some respects, more seeker sensitive in that it's not seeking to give so much it's an Orthodox perspective, but not an Orthodox polemic. And so the book very much is very impartial and tries to weigh the evidence as it stands. Mm-hmm. And to do that, though, requires really reading the sources and telling the story the sources actually provide, and not, let's say, something anachronistic from a different time or place. And so that sounds awfully Orthodox, but again, it's because the church was Orthodox in the beginning, but that wasn't really the methodology I was trying to research the book. I really wanted to make a historical case, but you find to do good history, you actually end up having to deal with Orthodox theology on these matters. In a broader way, and when you talk to people, what's the best book I should read on history of the papacy? And people are oftentimes saying, well, Papalism by Denny. And I always found like it's interesting that we are recommending people to read an Anglican heretics book, that we haven't come up with a better book from our own side. There's Uncut Mountain Press, I do know, is going to be reprinting Father Gayet's book on the papacy. But there has been something newer since then that really addresses the new evidence that's out there, and written in more of a modern tone, because back then it was very transparently polemical, and people, when they're weighing these issues, consider that maybe too impartial, or too partial rather, as compared to impartial. So I want to write a kind of like a modern treatment using the modern scholarship, newly translated text, and to give people a real idea of what the early ecclesiology of the church was. But I see you got the book there, Father.
We got the book. Yeah, this is the page. I'm going to give we're going to give the website here right now. So if people want to go, they can find it, put it on the screen here for you. So go over there to uncutmountainpress.com and just look for the first book that's going to come up on the page when you go to the book page is the newest book, which is Rise and Fall of the Papacy. So this is we have a preview there. We've got a video we could actually show. If you want to show, we could also show the video tonight, but people can check it out on the webpage as well. And we have the table of contents we want to show people in a minute. But it is just out 5 days now, circulating, and as I said, 374 pages and addresses. Let's go to the table of contents here, and we can kind of chat about the table of contents. I think it'll be easy for you to kind of help the future readers to get a sense of what the book's all about. So you've got your introduction, which is really important, resetting one's historical presumptions, right? The presuppositions going into anything are extremely important.
It's because a big reason for that is, in a lot of the treatments of this issue, they're mostly, because we're reading in English, we're speaking in English, they're going to be for Roman Catholics or Protestants. And so for Roman Catholics, the presumptions they're making are going to be presuming upon Vatican I. And if they're Protestants, what they're presuming upon, it's whatever is not Vatican I. But the goalposts are always Vatican I. And so it's really kind of a loaded set of dice to play with if you're doing historical inquiry. And so the introduction's not too long, but it really challenges the reader to get past some of the treatments we've had in the past, whether it be Chadwick or J.N.D. Kelly, and where even if they're not Roman Catholics, they're looking at the issue not as an impartial historian would, but really through the Pope-colored lenses, so to say. And so I challenge the reader not to do this. I very briefly put forward historical methodology, which is to draw a narrative from the actual sources and not to impose a narrative from a different time and place. And then I pose that narrative with not a lot of citations, because the idea is to give you the narrative and then prove it out century by century with the sources, with all the footnotes. It's like 800 something footnotes in the book, where you can see, wait, that narrative is actually what it is. And so that's the role of the introduction. But for someone who's not into they feel like they're already Orthodox, I think they could go jump right into chapter 1, for example. But for those who need some of those more details, that their mind's almost twisted by the presumptions of us being in the West, that they're looking for the papacy under every rock and all that stuff, I think that introduction is very important.
Well, I've seen that there's quite a lot of activity on the side of the apologists for the papacy as of late. So we see some books coming out from certain apologists. Is that also in part why you felt there was this book was also needed at this time?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, a big motivation has been the misinformation that's been coming from Roman Catholic apologists the last few years. Whether from good motives, bad motives, whether honest motives, dishonest motives, kind of irrelevant. The point is what they're saying is inaccurate and correct. In the last I don't know, 12 months, we got a book from Eric Ybarra. We have a book from Michael Lofton. There'll be another book from what's his name from First Peter 5. He's going to hate me for forgetting. He's another Timothy. I forget his last name at the moment. I'm sorry. But the point is, he got all these big guys coming out with these different books against Eastern Orthodoxy. And we're much smaller than them. They're big. And so what I felt was needed was something that gives a substantial response that is so substantial, everyone's going to look at all those books and just see them as a waste of time. More so than that, a big inspiration for this book was almost this kind of foreboding feeling that it couldn't get done. Perhaps the best Roman Catholic book on the topic is Keys Over the Christian World by Scott Butler and John Colarafi. And to anyone who's read it, even though it has certain papal presuppositions, so people aware to define terms, the presupposition is something we assume from the onset. It's not very thick with them compared to most Roman Catholic or even Protestant books for that matter. It's actually sort of the opposite. It's almost like a 600-page quote mine of all church history. So the point being is, it was a very well-researched book. And I go, wow, how could someone best this book with the kind of research it did? And that almost inspired me to make the case century by century how the papacy developed. And when you look at the development of the papacy, you actually have to start with, well, what was the original ecclesiology of everybody? And you find if you start with the original ecclesiology of everyone, you find that Roman papacy really isn't any different than any patriarchate until you get to the 9th century. And so that was a very interesting thing to really nail down, studying thoroughly all the sources when writing this book.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So this is going to be something that they're going to have to deal with in the realm of apologetics if they want to be serious. I want to show the folks the back cover before I forget. I just love this imagery.
Oh yeah.
You've got four thrones there that are Byzantine style, right? Byzantine thrones that you can find in churches in Greece today, and then you have the unfortunate fallen one, which is the one that we saw on the front cover. But it is a description of a grave tragedy. This book, right? Because we have the fall of the papacy, which was perhaps the most consequential ecclesiastical event in the history of the church, at least post schism, of what it brought about, what it began, the dissolution of Christianity in the West, and we're living now the fruits of 1,000 years of apostasy, and just the progressive dissolution that happened that really was set off with the fall of the papacy.
And there is a real rise and there is a real fall, but it's not the way people think about it. We often think of rise and fall as in, rising is greatness and attaining secular heights and power. But if we're speaking in the matter of ecclesiology and Christian religion, that is not necessarily a rise. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Lord says the greatest among you will serve. And when the Roman Church served its role, having teaching authority and honorary authority, the Roman Church was a great boon to the church because it helped the other patriarchates go out of heresy. But when the Roman Church started getting political independence, and then over decades, this was sort of used in order as leverage to get kind of these geopolitical concessions in the Balkans and stuff like this. When politics got involved, then really what we started seeing was ecclesiology being adapted to the political situation, and it sadly mutated and eventually led to the fall of Roman ecclesiology. And that's really what the fall of the papacy is. Now
you say here on the front page, we have "Believe Facts Rather Than Words" by Pope Gregory, St. Gregory the Great. Why do you think, why do we put that there? Why is that important?
I think it's a great quote because it says in very few words how we should be approaching matters when reading them, especially with ancient sources. All we have are really words and cryptic archaeological evidence. So we got to be very careful we go about it. Now, St. Pope Gregory the Great was when he said that, speaking about in response to false allegations about himself. The idea was that's not how convincing the allegation sounds, but the facts at hand determines whether the allegation is true. Now, Roman Catholics often approach history in a way that presumes upon their anachronistic papal institution being the most fitting explanation of historical event, and they will also take words like honorifics just at face value. Now, think about this. That's something that Pope Gregory would caution against, not to just take at face value anything you hear. We are to interpret truth claims by assessing the facts at hand, right? That's Pope Gregory the Great's point, even if he wasn't necessarily addressing historical methodology, just how we deal with allegations, but the logic is identical. So my application is to take all the statements of men, these ecclesiastics during the time, not just popes in isolation, and compare them to what they were doing and what actually happened. And those are the facts, right? Like with science, you don't just make a theory and go, that theory sounds really good, and so we don't have to actually ever test this theory and see if it works, right? It's nice to take the medicine, test it, make sure it's safe, make sure it actually cures the disease, right? Before saying, well, the theory shows it's going to cure disease. We don't have to test anything. Well, we don't have like an empirical laboratory to do tests with history. So we have our sources, whether they archaeological, historical, and the actual tests to see how did those actors act and what was the result of their actions. That's how we actually test the words. And that's why we want to believe facts rather than the words. Essentially, it's my point in saying there needs to be some sort of empirical notion when interpreting history. And when we deal with popularly apologetics, you will get people say, well, doesn't this sound good? Or doesn't this sound convincing? That's actually completely irrelevant. That's not how you would test anything scientifically, and it ought to not be how we do history.
So before we go on, I want to answer a question here, because someone, interesting question here posed. It's from, I'm not sure the name is written correctly, Tian's Mary. I have two questions. Oh, no, that's not what we want. We want the previous one. I'm sorry, right here. Then we'll get back to that one.
Sorry, Mary.
This is from, I don't know, Swig. Isn't this info relevant to those discerning between Catholicism and Orthodoxy? Which direction a person goes does impact their salvation. So that's one question, and there's another one that's actually also relevant. So this is just for those who are not Orthodox and they're looking into Orthodoxy, or is it also for the Orthodox?
It's very helpful for those people, though I would caution. I think the best video ever on this topic was actually yours, because you said if you're even asking whether there's a case between Orthodoxy and Roman Catholic, you're still thinking like a Roman Catholic, right? When you understand church history as the saints do, as the sources just lay out, the Roman Catholic case is irrelevant. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so, yes, it helps you weigh the case by all means, because I'm giving the reader a lot of facts at disposal. But I'll just let you know this: if you think you're still weighing them, you're thinking like a Roman Catholic. You're just not all there yet, which is fine, because none of us were, especially in the West, were just born Orthodox with Orthodox presuppositions. Be born in a Greek family, but you're surrounded by just what's in America. It takes prayer and good works and scripture reading and spiritual disciplines in order to acquire an Orthodox mindset in reality. It's not something you're just born with. This society does everything to take that away from you. But let me just speak very simply. Yes, it's going to help someone make the case, because I recommend buy this book and acquire Eric Ybarra's and Michael Lofton's, and you're just going to see, what's in this book is going to address everything you're looking for, and you're not going to find that, I think, in any other book. But that's why I think also for someone who is Orthodox, someone who's just interested in history, someone that's just more informed and not necessarily just inquirer, this book is very, very detailed. It's got a lot of sources it brings to bear. And so I think anyone could benefit from this book, even someone who's very well read. Amongst the reviewers for this book are a set of teachers in a seminary. So this is something that I think even a seminarian professor could benefit from.
I'm gonna help you answer this next question once you give your 2 cents. I understand this stuff is relevant to church history, but in comparison to things that accompany salvation, isn't this stuff just petty nuances?
I would actually say no, because if you could address this question appropriately, it actually does pertain to salvation because it helps you center what the church is, and that is who Christ is, because the church is the body of Christ. A lot of what the first chapter unpacks is what the epistemology and ecclesiology of the early church is. Epistemology is the theory of knowing, like how do you know something is true? And that's, you don't have to get all fancy with it. It's just, well, how do we know anything is true? A lot of us have presuppositions, like we talked about, and there's really nothing wrong with that. You can't reinvent the wheel with every new thing you ever do. But you have to have some idea of what is a presupposition that we accept uncritically, like the Bible's word of God, the saints are inspired, and they're trustworthy in telling us what the teaching of the scriptures, the tradition of the church is, like things like that, right? Like we're not going to reinvent the wheel for those things unless for the most skeptical person. But what do we do beyond that? Well, then you need to identify, well, what is the epistemology of the church? Because this actually informs the ecclesiology of the early church. And what we find is it's the consensus of the saints and bishops is what that epistemology is. The church understood this right from the beginning. You see this in Acts chapter 15. And so when you recognize that, it actually kind of informs how you'd almost go about anything spiritually, right? You'll read your scriptures, but you'll have the conviction that your understanding should be according to the consensus of the church. And if you're feeling dissuaded because of just some of the bad things happening in modern times, and not to burst anyone's bubbles, there's always been corruption and sin throughout Christian history. So what we have today is just a different kind of corruption and sin that manifests itself in all different ways throughout history. So you're not to think like, oh, well, there's a lot of people having it wrong today. They're doing sinful things or wrong things. What am I to do? You'd realize, well, that's, it's not like a popular vote. You need a consensus of the saints and a consensus of all the bishops alive to really, to have a utter conviction. This is what's really going on. The Holy Spirit requires of us. Now, this way, like if God forbid in Nicaea 25, this council will go down in the future, as Father, you and I discussed, if there's a couple jurisdictions that end up going into schism and joining the heretics, there'll be Roman Catholic apologists that will say, oh, well, this shows that, the Orthodox are in schism, the ones that joined us are the correct ones. But I think a book like this, you'd realize that's actually not the historical nor Orthodox way of looking at that question. So it could affect salvation if you take what you learn and apply it to having a more stable faith, into having a more obedient faith to that of the saints, because in reality, that's how the early church operated according to consensus. And that's the thread that is throughout this whole book. And that thread is very useful in the spiritual life as well.
I would take it one step further. That's all true. And then go one step further. And that is, when we think about our salvation, it's not us and God. Orthodoxy is not us and God. We are very much constantly cognizant of our brethren, the church at large, and we're in pain with it, we suffer with it, and we're concerned about it. And so many people say the same thing about the pan-heresy of ecumenism. What does that have to do with me? I'm just a lowly layman. I can't do anything. This is something that belongs to the theologians and the bishops. And this perception itself is a problem. It's very problematic. It's not an Orthodox perception of things. We all are bearing one another's burden, according to the Apostle Paul. And so your salvation is bound up with everyone else's salvation. And if there are people who are erring in the faith within the church or among the heterodox, that's a part of your concern, my concern, the whole body's concern. We're in pain for the sake of the brethren and their salvation. And so this book is absolutely, and every book that touches on the dogma of the church, the identity of Christians, the course of history. You can't understand history if you don't go back to the schism and understand what happened there and why the West departed from Orthodoxy and how that's affected everything going forward. The whole world now is basically been dominated by the Western outlook, the Western mentality through the rise of globalism and the spread of heterodoxy throughout the world. So if you are concerned about your salvation, you can't but be concerned about the salvation of everyone. And therefore, this book's going to help you understand church history, theology, what happened. It's going to help you to understand the nature of the church, the identity of the church, that we're not papists. We don't have a papal ecclesiology. Today, there's a rise of a papal ecclesiology within the church. We have ideas and expressions and actions on the part of theologians and hierarchs that reminds us not of Orthodox conciliar ecclesiology, but papal ecclesiology. And so this is very relevant to today and what's happening in the church with ecumenism. So, I mean, I think we have a problem with maybe we're infected with the Protestant, me and my Bible, me and my Lord, I'm going to be saved on my own kind of thing. And hey, salvation is basically my, there's various expressions, me and my Bible, but there's also an orthodoxy, me and my prayer rope. Yes, absolutely. The prayer rope we've talked about, we've taught about it. It's with us. It's a center of our spiritual life. But that's in order to, and if you look at the lives of the saints, in order to then serve the church and love the brethren and be in pain for the whole church. I mean, Saint Basil famously was basically seen as the bishop of the church in his day, right? He was concerned about the whole Catholic, in other words, the whole church. And he was in pain, and he was writing the Western bishops to help them against the Arians. And he was not in his, my diocese, my parish, my flock. That was not how he understood his role in the church. And neither should you or I say, it's my little world, my little parish, my little thing. Yes, that's the first and foremost, but not exclusively. And so I think part of that, the problem with that question, or the issue with that question, is not so much that we have to answer and defend the book. It's that, how do we understand salvation, right? And so it's very important that we're,
The scriptures say, if I have faith that can move mountains, I have not love, I have nothing. Right.
Yes.
So it's this idea that this rugged individual faith, it's from the West. It's mostly actually from even the United States. Even Protestantism with state churches for until like the 1800s, pretty much. So this kind of individualistic faith it's not historically Christian. And that's why, things like schism are bad, because God's saving a people, right? He's bringing a people to himself, the new Israel of God.
That's right.
So it's about the whole church. We're all in this together.
All right, fantastic. Let's move on. Did you want to give us any examples with regard to, let's say, the question of the idea of papal supremacy in church history? What would you say would be among the strongest quotations you found, sources you found, to show that, in fact, the popes themselves, the West itself, did not understand a Vatican I ecclesiology, that is an infallible supreme pontiff over the whole church, and everything has to go through Rome, even if you're in far off Jerusalem or Antioch or Alexandria or whatever? What would you say, just to give the people a sense of what you're dealing with in the book?
That's a good question. I have a quote in mind. It's not perhaps the strongest. If you read every quote that is out there, every passage that's out there that weighs in on the question, but it's the most bite-sized and easiest to digest and quote mineable, because what one finds is that a papal ecclesiology is essentially cherry-picked quote mining, because when you look at anything in context, none of what the quote mines say really bring out the bear what these sources are talking about. But I'll give a quote that's quote mineable from the Orthodox perspective. But when you believe facts rather than words, you'll find that the words are borne out in the facts. So that quote is from St. Pope Martin. He wrote to a cleric in Jerusalem. And the quote is, and he's speaking of Stephen of Dora, the kind of substitute locum tenens patriarch of Jerusalem. He was ordered to ordain bishops and priests and deacons according to the canons, as far as power was lacking to us to appoint the Patriarch of Jerusalem to build holy orders. All right. So the quote says, power was lacking to us to appoint the Patriarch of Jerusalem. So anyone just listening to this right now knows what it sounds like. It sounds like that Martin does not have direct jurisdiction over Jerusalem or the power to ordain a new Patriarch of Jerusalem. I mean, that's just what he says. But it's more than just words. The facts at hand confirm this. The context of the quote is that due to Muslim domination and a non-canonical pretender acting as patriarch of Jerusalem, and this was Sergius of Joppa, he had a legal translation to Jerusalem, there's a lack of canonical clergy, which is creating a crisis for the local Jerusalem Synod. All right. So the only solution is to recognize the work being done through Stephen Adora, according to Pope Martin. And Stephen Adora, being the locum tenens appointed by the last legitimate patriarch, Saint Sophronius of Jerusalem, is the only person that the Synod in any respect has given approval to, right? And so the context, if you read the whole letter, if you read the whole paragraph, if you know the history around it, is pretty clear that what it sounds like, he doesn't have the power to ordain a new bishop of Jerusalem, is actually what it means. It's not some sort of out of context framing of the quote. Now, the only ad hoc, which is like a made up excuse I've seen Roman Catholics attempt with this quote, is that lacking power refers to some sort of political or physical capacity. Like somehow Martin's incapable of appointing a new bishop of Jerusalem. And so going by this papalist presupposition, nothing otherwise can stop Martin from appointing a new patriarch of Jerusalem other than these practical constraints, right? That's the reinterpretation of the passage I've heard given. Here's why that's wrong. Now, the letter, for example, was sent from Rome to Jerusalem, right? I mean, it's a letter from Pope Martin to a cleric in Jerusalem. So this physically demonstrates that Martin was more than capable of taking someone from Rome and getting them to Jerusalem, or the letter itself couldn't get there. So this idea that he lacked the power to physically get a human body there to be bishop is just bad read. It makes no sense. And so, because why not just send a new patriarch by that logic? He would have been able to. On top of this, Stephen Adora was at a nearby monastery at the writing this letter after having left Rome that same year. So you actually were able to get a bishop from Rome to the vicinity of Jerusalem. So nothing physically impeded bishops from leaving Rome and going to the general area. It's just this kind of ad hoc that Roman Catholic apologetics may bring up. That's all it is. They're just trying to come up with an excuse. The context doesn't allow you to come up with this interpretation. It also worth pointing out that during the Crusades, the Pope of Rome appointed a new patriarch of Alexandria in absentia without having any clergy in Egypt whatsoever, because the crusade in Egypt failed. So clearly, during the 13th century, it was considered within the Pope's power among the papalists to appoint a new patriarch. But this is clearly not the case during the 7th century, right? Because he didn't just appoint someone in absentia, which theoretically he could have done if he had the same Vatican I presuppositions that grew out of the medieval church, like the one in the 13th century. So papal apologists will, I think, often leave the realm of history and just claim that the statement we read from Pope Martin was an ex cathedra statement, so thereby it's fallible, right? So it's kind of this irrelevant statement because it's not an infallible statement from a pope, because apparently that's all that matters. But this is kind of useless to the historian, this way of thinking. That's apologetics brain. It's really not how one would approach the question historically, because no one thought or spoke this way in the 7th century. It's historically irrelevant. As a matter of history, here's what we know. Martin was unaware of himself having the power to appoint a new patriarch, right? And why? Because he was completely unaware of the existence of direct jurisdiction, right? That is something, if he denies it, he wasn't denying it because he thought someone might think he had direct jurisdiction. That wasn't even an idea that existed at the time. He just wasn't aware of him having the capacity to ordain a new bishop of Jerusalem. So this begs the question, how can direct jurisdiction even exist if the Pope does not know about it? Right? Mm-hmm. If direct jurisdiction was a papal doctrine that existed at all in any form of the early church, then how does the Pope not know about it that he denies it? If it's a doctrine,
where you deal with that? Is this where you deal with it? Did I find where you're dealing with it? We're in, let's see, we're in the Lateran Council of 649. Just so people, if they're
yes, the book, I mean, I discuss it in that chapter in the quote. Not so much the objections, because the book's about history, but that's why I want to, in my study of the history, that one quote, I do not have the power to appoint a new patriarch of Jerusalem. If that doesn't end Vatican I, then what possibly can? You have to ask the papal apologists, what would you want to hear from a pope for us to show you that your ecclesiology did not exist in the first millennium, because it doesn't get any clearer than that. You get other stuff too. For example, you have Pope Vigilius saying that he was deceived by Satan, right? So you have things like this that also exist, but I just feel like that's the easiest one sentence quotable that clearly shows what we were dealing with in the 7th century, where they didn't even conceive of direct jurisdiction, that the person in the know doesn't know about it. If that doesn't disprove the idea of direct jurisdiction being apostolic, then nothing can. Speaking historically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so people who have the book can go to that section there and they can check out and read further on that. So that's one example that you think. Go ahead, keep going.
Because ultimately, this is not a polemical book. Like, I already know, because I, have an apologetics YouTube channel and everything, that Roman Catholic apologists will say, well, it's a doctrinal development, there are seeds, blah, 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 blah. But historians don't deal with theoretical objections. I'm just dealing with what does the history actually state. And what the history actually states is the Pope is completely unaware of the existence of direct jurisdiction. In fact, he unconsciously, right, because he's not aware of its existence, denies its existence. That's what's historical fact. That I could tell you with confidence.
So what do you think is the most important contribution in this book to the present discourse on ecclesiology? So we have people here tonight, undoubtedly, who are here because they want to hear your take, the Orthodox take, on some of the key points that have been brought up in this discussion about ecclesiology, about, what is the Christian church's ecclesiology? Is it conciliar or is it papal? And so you have examined this. This is an historian and a theologian, Orthodox perspective. What do you want to point out for top 5 or whatever you want to give?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt the early church's ecclesiology was conciliar. There is zero doubt about that. It's a matter of moral certainty if you look at the sources. But the most it's humbling to say this book makes important contributions in the study of ecclesiology, but this book really does make important contributions in the study of ecclesiology. In fact, I couldn't even just pick one. There's I think five different sections of chapters which in of themselves could be peer-reviewed, academically published theses. And among those would be this, and it's going to blow people's minds because they're not used to hearing these things this way, but if you read the sources, this is what's borne out. So, for example, during the Easter controversy, as it's called, and Pope Victor's excommunication of Ephesus was actually over debated local jurisdiction over Ephesus, which the rest of the church denied. All right. And you don't hear that in most treatments or really any treatments, but this is something that I very carefully proved out from the sources. For example, the baptism controversy in the next century between St. Cyprian and Pope Stephen was over the latter allegedly allowing the reception of baptisms in the proper form, which Pope Dionysius then later changed. I mean, the first book that, the only book that's ever even mentioned that the Pope Dionysius who changed the practice was the Orthodox Ethos book on baptism. That's the first one to bring it up. And I'm the first person I'm aware to actually publicly give this thesis, but it's clearly in Eusebius, which we'll discuss in a little bit.
I can't wait to hear. This is going to be the most important, most interesting part for me tonight, because that's
I know that's your big issue.
That's my big issue. And also, of course, we published a book on it. So this is fascinating. I'd love to hear what the papal apologists have to say about that.
But I mean, there's other really important points that are made in this book. The Formula Hormistas was actually a kind of lackluster compromise document. Because if you remove the sort of papal presuppositions and you just go by this document was talking about Chalcedon vis-a-vis the Henoticon and what compromises are made to get people that actually sign it, you realize it really has nothing to do with the papal question whatsoever, which is because no one cares about the Henoticon anymore. That's how no one addresses this document. But I carefully lay out that that's not the case, that, this document really is somewhat lackluster for ecclesiastical purposes, though it's very interesting historically, of course. Another is St. Pope Gregory the Great's objection to the term ecumenical patriarch. This is a hot take. It was over money in local jurisdiction in the Balkans. And he inadvertently wrote all sorts of things that directly contradict later papalist ideas, right? Not knowing he was when he was writing these things about the term ecumenical patriarch. I will discuss in a little bit so people don't slice and dice my quotables. Well, just because a saint had worldly considerations doesn't mean they were doing anything impious. He was trying to defend his own local people he was accountable to, which they were being ripped off essentially by the government at that time. Because that never happens, right? Government never rips people off. But that's a whole other question. And another one, which is, I think, perhaps the most dense discussion in the book, is how the Latin minutes in Nicaea II contain forged interpolations due to Anastasius the librarian. And that really dovetails to how Anastasius the librarian essentially rebooted the Orthodox papacy and invented the medieval papacy, whose epitome would prove to be Vatican I.
Is this now something? Is this also something that you would say is original, or it's been discussed quite extensively by historians?
I would say that all the dots are out there in academia. I was the first to connect the dots, but just so you know, I'm not a nut. Someone independent for me, while this book was finished, when it was in typesetting, actually published the same thesis, Dr. Evangelos Chrysos. And I'm like, oh, I'm putting that citation into the book. So it was published in July. And so as it's being typesetted, when the footnotes are updated to include this research. So it's literally cutting edge research that's brand new to 2023, but this recognition that this is something invented from Anastasius, it has begun. I mean, I'm the first person aware to publicly come out with it, but now I'm not the first academic to actually address it.
And that's pretty much in your last chapter, correct? We're looking at
the last two chapters, because you can't really understand Nicaea II and the manuscript differences without realizing who's the person who started altering the manuscript, but especially the last chapter.
So chapters 8 and 9, the 8th century of the papacy and the 9th century, which you also go from the 9th to the 11th. You talk about the post-schism reality a bit toward the end.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So what would be, you would have to begin on the 8th. If you really want to dive deep into Anastasius and your analysis, you'd have to begin with the 8th. But it kind of goes deeper in the 9th, looks like.
Yes. And to be fair, someone who just wants to get, I never heard of this Anastasius before, and I don't want to hear a bunch of nitty-gritty on manuscripts, they'd be just fine turning to the 9th chapter and reading that. It would give you all the details you really need. Well, I'll get into this a little bit, but Anastasius is a very interesting character, to say the least. Probably the most important human being alive who you never heard of if you're the average human being. So he's an interesting character. But maybe if we have some time, I could go through more the nitty gritty of those different topics that I think especially are important contributions.
Tell me, are you going to be addressing him at all at the conference in March, or is it going to be more what leads up to 69, 70, and then 79 and the Eighth Ecumenical?
Oh no, I'm going to be running to Anastasius head on, because the reason the Eighth Council ever had to happen was because of Anastasius. And Anastasius wrote, to quote him, almost all of the papal correspondence during the Phodian controversy. And so you have to talk about Anastasius. You have to talk about what he's writing about and what he was inventing, because the Eighth Council was kind of like this moderate repudiation, because they weren't looking to they were looking to bring Rome back on board, and we'll discuss this a little later maybe, but it was a repudiation of the Anastasian program. I think they didn't go far enough. Photius was too nice, St. Photius, and maybe that's something we can learn in the future, that you can't meet people too much in the middle when there's really profound problems. And that was something.
I don't think. Yeah, I wonder if the East understood just how profound things were in the West at the time.
Oh, they almost certainly didn't. They had some indications. For example, Pope John VIII even flat out said, "Oh, what they're doing is blasphemous, but we want to slowly bring them back." Flat out. I mean, he wrote to Photius and said that there was heretics in the West, but he didn't want them excommunicated over it. And so, I do think, and this is me with my commentator hat on, it's not so much historian, but think about this. If in 2 years they want a church union, and they say, oh, well, we'll get the union done. They're signing a good document, and not everyone's all there yet intellectually and spiritually, but we'll get them there. Well, we've run into this before, and it didn't work. It didn't work as good as it could have. Now, there's other things that the the West did to pretty much abandon the Eighth Council, which are also to blame. But the point is, people should be down 100% what they're signing on, and that's the only way really to have a enduring union. We would, I think, we'll discuss during the conference. We need to revisit the Eighth Council, and then we need to go farther and more specific than the Eighth Council. In some respects, St. Photius was being almost too pastoral and not idealistic enough, because he didn't know the future. Obviously, he didn't know how the West would pivot after that council. But it's an interesting question.
We're looking at some of the chapter headings here, and some of the even in the ebook, we've got some wonderful illustrations and icons. So that's was there more to that question? The topics, the most important that this book makes, it ends with Anastasius and how we get to the schism.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Well, if you like, what I'll do is I'll unpack those topics. You wanted to talk about baptism.
Yeah.
We'll make our way. We'll make our way to Anastasius. So
yeah, let's do that.
Let's talk about the Easter controversy real quick. Right? If everyone thinks the Easter controversy was about Easter, people have the wrong day for Easter, and and Pope Victor was trying to, he found that it's super objectionable, and Ephesus was, just being too stubborn, and then he excommunicated from the whole church. And that's what most people think about it. But this is really not what it's about. And let me explain. Now, indeed, Ephesus was condemned for celebrating Easter on Saturday, and they're condemned by Rome, but all the world synods, with the exclusion of Antioch, which one of the footnotes against whom may be why, but not really important for our purposes right now. Now, if you keep reading Eusebius, Ephesus wrote a letter where they cite the importance of relics in this letter. They name Saints John and Philip of the apostles, and they talk about their relics, but they omit any mention of Timothy's, even though they were in Ephesus. That was common knowledge in the ancient world that St. Timothy's relics were in Ephesus. Why is this the case? Why is their response to Rome condemning them on Easter this arcane discussion on relics? Well, the letter does not say. Eusebius cites Irenaeus writing after the fact that St. Polycarp presided over a liturgy instead of Pope Anicetus. Now, in liturgics, only equals or superiors can preside over a liturgy. So let's keep that detail amongst other details. What do other contemporary documents add? Well, for example, during the 2nd century, St. Dionysius of Corinth he writes a letter to the Pope of Rome, a different Pope of Rome, and he speaks of Corinth and Rome being in what he calls a close union, because he actually explains their churches were planted by Peter and Paul, right? So apparently churches planted by specific apostles are part of a certain union. It sounds like a jurisdiction. Now, in the 3rd century, St. Anatolius of Laodicea reports, to quote him, that Polycrates, and he was the bishop of Ephesus during this Easter controversy, appeared to have, he says, the primacy over the bishops of Asia vis-a-vis Pope Victor. So without those modern presuppositions, something to do with Pope Victor excommunicating from the church, going by what the documents actually say, Ephesus had its own patriarch equal to the Pope. All right. Churches had unions based upon who planted them. Even though Timothy was the 2nd bishop of Ephesus after St. Paul, he was deliberately not mentioned by the Ephesian church, and that Polycrates claimed primacy. So this is what the sources actually talk about, that Ephesus, right, they are an equal patriarch because they're, Polycarp was presiding over a liturgy, and he's from that jurisdiction. You couldn't preside over a liturgy unless he was the Pope's equal, right? This is what they say. They're a union. This is what Dionysius of Corinth says. Timothy's not mentioned. Why were they leaving out his relics, right? These are very important questions. None of the sources mention anything about papal supremacy, but going just by the evidence, the debate was over Polycrates' primacy and independence from the Roman union or patriarchate. That's why they left out discussion of Timothy's relics. And that's why it was only after that letter, when they left out discussion of Timothy's relics, that Pope Victor excommunicated the Ephesians. It wasn't over Easter. It was over the letter where they said that we have the Apostle John's relics, the Apostle Philip's relics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. the idea was the relics determined the local jurisdiction. That's why the close union of churches, St. Peter and Paul, includes Corinth and Rome, because St. Peter and Paul evangelized Corinth, just like they evangelized Rome, right? So those relics in Rome put them in union because they have the same evangelist. Well, one could argue that so did Ephesus. St. Paul and then St. Timothy evangelized Ephesus, but as Polycrates points out, St. John and St. Philip also went there, and it's like an apostolic succession reset. And so the argument was over this local jurisdiction, and that's why it's only after this comment on relics they get excommunicated. Now, why have you never heard this before, dear audience? Because people's presuppositions color the episode that it's about papalism, when such an idea is not invoked or implied in any document whatsoever. Now, people are also unaware that Ephesus claimed to be what was later called the Patriarchate. Like you never really read about that. But historians and early sources acknowledge this. This is not like something that's esoteric to people that study the sources. They were aware that Ephesus was the Patriarchate of Asia, Caesarea perhaps. They kind of vied for primacy in Asia. Asia Minor is Turkey today. But the relics of St. Andrew, as well as the relics of St. Timothy, were transferred to Constantinople. And the intention was, by moving those relics, they could kind of move the primacy to Constantinople. So these were things which, by the way, liturgically celebrated by the Coptics, by ourselves, by the Roman Catholics. This is something we're all aware of. But because a lot of historians aren't like reading the lives of the saints, they're not reading what holiday is in the church and on a given day. It's the day of the translation, the relic of St. Timothy or whatever. A lot of historians are just thinking of modern debates. They're not looking at what people in the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th century found important. And that's why they missed the importance of this episode.
So this actually has been ignored as an episode of ecclesiology, and
Absolutely. It shouldn't even be called the Easter controversy. It should be called the Ephesian controversy. The real excommunication was over jurisdiction. They didn't excommunicate when they had a falling out on the dating of Easter. What happened was, like I said, there's that letter on the relics. Then Rome excommunicated them, and then Saint Irenaeus wrote letters to, as Eusebius says, to all the churches in the world, condemning Pope Victor, sharply rebuking him, because the idea was, according to Irenaeus, well, Polycarp, a couple popes ago, presided over the liturgy, right? So you don't have the capacity to excommunicate the church in Ephesus. So this is, I think, the real emphasis is missed because people are looking at this with Western presuppositions and not according to the sources, and certainly not according to Orthodox presuppositions.
So how would they unpack it? Why wouldn't they say? How would they say this is not a rebuttal to the idea of papal supremacy? Yes, it developed, but it was in some kind of form. It must have existed then, right, for them.
Yeah, see, that's the problem. See, this, like, Anglicans and Protestants will quote this episode, and they'll quote Eusebius, who says that Pope Victor attempted to excommunicate the Pope of Rome. I mean, the Bishop of Ephesus. Pope of Rome attempted to excommunicate him. And so the Protestants, and some Orthodox, thinking like I think like a Protestant, will say, oh, well, that shows he attempted, he couldn't do it. But then the Roman Catholic will go back, well, they thought they couldn't do it, but he wouldn't attempt it if the Pope himself didn't think he could do it. So then you have the papal apologists saying, well, there's the seat of papal supremacy. Just Victor was denied his own ability to do it, and everyone else thought he couldn't do it, but he knew he could do it. But this is, as you could tell, this is not very historical sounding, right? It's sort of like bickering back and forth. Could he do it? Could he not do it? The sources don't even talk about that. The sources just say he attempted to do something, and the reason they rejected him was having to do with the relics and having to do with the Polycarp presiding over a liturgy. And so then the historian, right, not acting like an apologist, someone actually addressing this historically, has to say, why did St. Irenaeus and why did Polycrates leave these details? What is the relevance of these details? And what people do too commonly is they go, well, they're ancient, so they're stupid. They left stupid details. Well, you know what? That's a stupid way of doing history. we have to presume that these people were the geniuses of their day, and if they left those details, they had some sort of relevance. So now the historian has to weigh the probabilities. What was the relevance of these statements? And what I presented here in brief was, well, if we actually look at the details and what their most likely ramifications were, the relevance had to do with local jurisdiction. That's what actually makes sense. And in fact, it allows you to explain what happens without taking ideas from the 1800s and from Western Europe and imposing them upon Turkey.
Very good. Let's go on to the baptism controversy, which is fascinating. This is really important because it's kind of I think a revelation. It'll be a revelation for a lot of people because we have been under the weight of the papal spin on this for a millennium, and a lot of Orthodox are very much, unfortunately, buying into this, thinking that this is a part of the Orthodox tradition. Let's hear more about this.
Yeah, this is interesting because when it comes to the baptism issue, I don't really have a polemical axe to grind per se. I'm not a bishop. Like, I have opinions, but it's like not the thing that really gets me like going, right? And some people debating about this, it really gets them going. So the question is, well, why was I looking into this? Because it's relevant to the study of the papacy. So let me tell the viewers, as someone who's kind of looking at this, not really invested into the baptism issue, what the sources actually bring out, because it's not what you think. Now, before the controversy, St. Cornelius, Pope of Rome, not only rejected novation because of his baptism being by effusion, so clearly baptismal form meant something, because this is clearly in the Sysmatic letter of Pope Cornelius. He clearly accepted that all bishops and churches were fundamentally equal. Now, his synod, because he wasn't pope yet when this was written, but his synod wrote, and usually when a synod writes, it probably was written by its most notable deacon, which would become the next pope. So there's a good reason to believe Pope Cornelius wrote this himself just before he was consecrated. He said that the following, that cannot be a firm decree which shall not appear to have had the consent of very many. Right? So this is a papal statement, but you're not going to hear that anymore from a pope, but you hear that from Pope Cornelius. Another statement, for example, on the topic, he says, it behooves us all, and he's speaking of Africa and Rome, to watch for the body of the whole church, right? So this pastoral job of the bishop isn't just something for the Pope of Rome, it's something he sees as the whole church. But here's what I think is the most important statement he makes, because we're going to see it quoted back at him and to other popes. It's this. He says, they, and he's speaking of the bishops, owe their conscience to God alone as the judge, yet desire that their doings should be approved also by the brethren themselves. It is no wonder, Brother Cyprian, we should be found not so much judges of as sharers in your council. So after Cornelius' death, St. Pope Stephen, on another issue, got into a tussle with St. Cyprian, not only over these different views of who they should be communing with in Spain.
Can we just I want to restate that because we're just now seeing it on the screen. Let's read it again. They, the bishops, owe their conscience to God alone as the judge, yet desire that their doings should be approved also by their brethren themselves. It is no wonder, Brother Cyprian, we should be found, and it's cut off because it's not, we should be found not so much judges of as sharers in your council. All right, so clear this is coming from the Pope of Rome at the time, the Patriarch of Rome at the time.
Yes, right? This comes from the Roman Synod to Africa, to the Carthaginian Synod. And we could see that Rome is not the judges, they're sharers in council, right? Yes, every bishop alone is accountable to God, right? They can give their own judgment, but we should look to have consensus, right? They should be approved by the brethren themselves. So we could see the consensus-based ecclesiology, this idea that the church's government operates according to everyone being on the same page. But bishops individually having the capacity, they're not like puppets for another superior bishop, is something that we could read in Cornelius' Synod's statement to the African Synod. Now, this will be quoted back in their faces. And the reason this be quoted back in their faces, because St. Stephen of Rome, he's a miracle worker, but he was very much wrong on the baptism issue, historically speaking. Here's why. Now, he wrote, and this is to quote him, this is to quote St. Stephen, If anyone therefore come to you from any heresy whatever, and he also writes, and they seem to have already been baptized in the name of Jesus Christ, that those people's baptisms are acceptable. So the way these words were interpreted was that they allowed for heretics to be received that were baptized with incorrect form, that maybe only the name of Jesus was named, or there weren't 3 immersions. This is very relevant because the heretics in those days were Gnostics, and so they thought the Father was a demiurge. He was this Gnostic aeon, and he really wasn't God, and so they wouldn't want to name him during baptism. Or then you have the Priscillianist, the Montanist in Turkey. They would do single immersion baptism because they didn't believe in the Holy Trinity. So, like, these were real issues in the church, and this is something that we read in St. Firmilian, St. Dionysius of Alexandria, that they don't want those issues to be ignored. This is something that, if you take St. Stephen at his word, would be ignored. Now, St. Cyprian also rejected this idea, not simply for the reason of form, but he rejected all schismatic baptisms. It's interesting that those who didn't take as hard a stance as St. Cyprian, like St. Dionysius of Alexandria, he was specific that baptism needed correct form. So, and he saw himself as on the same page as St. Cyprian, not the same page as St. Stephen. How do we know this? Well, consider St. Cyprian's response to Stephen of Rome. He writes this: in which behalf we neither do violence to nor impose a law upon anyone, since each prelate has in the administration of the church the exercise of his will free, as he shall give an account of his conduct to the Lord. All right, so we see this statement from Cyprian that they're not going to listen to Stephen because they have their own freedom to act as they believe is right, and they'll be accountable to God. Well, where did we hear this? We heard this in Cornelius' letter from the Roman Synod, right? He's quoting that back at Stephen. He actually quotes it back at Cornelius earlier twice, so it's not the only time he ever does it, but it's something he does quite often. Now, consider this from St. Dionysius of Alexandria, who corrected Stephen very similarly. He said this: for these reasons, that we may be in accord, church with church, bishop with bishop, elder with elder, let us be careful with our utterances, meaning don't excommunicate people. Moreover, in judging and dealing with particular cases of baptism, we give instructions to the local primates who, under divine imposition of hands, were appointed to discharge these duties, for they shall give a summary account to the Lord of whatsoever they do. So this give an account to the Lord, literally the same exact thing that Cyprian said. And what Cyprian said was just a paraphrase of what Cornelius said. So they're quoting Cornelius back at Stephen as a way of showing you're wrong because the previous pope disagreed with you. Never seen this in any discussion of the topic, by the way. But it shows you that the ecclesiology of Rome was the same ecclesiology of Cyprian, the same ecclesiology of Stephen. It wasn't of Dionysius. This issue with Stephen was over baptism. It wasn't really over ecclesiology. Now, the controversy over baptism ends up resolving itself when Dionysius continues writing to Rome, and he reports that another Dionysius, this is future Pope Dionysius of Rome, right? So they're both named Dionysius. That this other Dionysius, the quote, Dionysius of Alexandria, formerly had held the same opinion as Stephen. I'm going to repeat that. Formerly had held the same opinion as Stephen. Because the belief was Stephen allowed all baptisms, even those with improper form, those that only named Jesus Christ. But Dionysius of Rome formerly had that opinion, but he had it no longer. And Dionysius' reason for saying that was because he claimed that Dionysius of Rome had his doctrine, which was you had to have correct form. And so what happens is even during the Donatist controversy, this is later, later saints like St. Augustine will say, well, the Marcionites have correct form, and that's why we accept their baptisms. But this would have not been true in the 3rd century, and this would have not been St. Stephen's reason for accepting their baptisms, because he allowed for improper form. This allowance, this requirement for proper form, according to Eusebius quoting St. Dionysius of Alexandria, was due to Dionysius of Rome formerly having that opinion. So to me, this kind of the whole argument that people will make that Cyprianic baptismal sacramentology is this sort of minor aberration, and it's not the teaching of the church, but the teaching of St. Stephen of Rome was the teaching of the church. It's just utterly ahistorical. It's not in the sources. So the primary sources that exist show that cannot be the case, because Rome's sacramentology is from Dionysius of Rome. And he got that from Dionysius of Alexandria, who wrote against Stephen. Mm. Now, why are people
never presented? I've never heard that even referenced, really. I mean, you're the first, and
the reason it comes up because it's the only way of understanding the ecclesiastical ramifications of what's occurring, how the different synods worked it out, and what happened was Cyprian appealed against Rome to St. Firmilian and apparently also to St. Dionysius of Alexandria. And the consensus of the church weighed against Rome, and then Rome corrected itself. That's the real history. That's what the sources actually say, and that's what you never hear. And so what some people...
They might come back and say, well, but subsequent history, does that prove itself out in the West? What would you say to that?
Well, this is interesting because you could read St. Augustine, you could read St. Jerome on these questions, and they'll quote the same sources I quote, but they don't quote Dionysius of Alexandria. They apparently had less access to his epistolary. And so this shows that their whole historical take, which became this kind of historical mythology of the West of this episode, was in error. So their history is wrong. It's not that they had any additional insight I have. In fact, if anything, because I could have sources from East and West, I have more details than they brought to bear. My opinion is that what happened in the West was this sort of opposition to Donatism that kind of led to this recasting of history at the expense of the Donatists, but sadly also at the expense of St. Cyprian. When you read other people from the 4th century, like St. Basil the Great, they don't have this distorted view because he wasn't dealing with Donatists. But with all the extant sources that exist, and so to deal with the historical question, dealing with a saint 100 years later may give us a good theological opinion, but it's not going to give us better history than what the actual sources say. So dealing with this as a historian, there's no doubt that, going by the sources, it was Stephen of Rome's sacramentology that was reformed by Rome, by Dionysius of Rome, and he got this from Dionysius of Alexandria. And Dionysius of Alexandria quoted St. Cyprian when writing to St. Stephen. He obviously saw himself on Cyprian's side. It was the Cyprianic, and it was really Cyprianic side that was the correct side on this issue ecclesiastically and according to sacramentology. Ultimately, the view that went out in its, I would say, most holistic form would have been Dionysius of Alexandria, right? The economic view. The Acrevia view of St. Cyprian is canonical and was accepted by Dionysius himself because he saw himself on Cyprian's side. But the allowance that Dionysius of Alexandria made became the same allowance that Rome reformed to. And I would venture to guess was the same one that they had before Stephen, because again, Cornelius made mention of novations, baptism by effusion in the negative. So it's kind of bizarre what led Stephen to have some sort of error on this issue, or he was misportrayed. But in the end, we just don't know. We just know what all the contemporaries.
What's curious is that in the West, they choose to, I mean, maybe they're ignorant of this, but they choose to ignore that, or they're ignorant of it, and they totally relativize the form post-schism with Aquinas. They just make it almost, well, it doesn't really matter if you immerse, it doesn't matter if you sprinkle, it doesn't matter if you pour, it's all the same. Would you say there's any,
ironically, I think that's unfair of Aquinas.
Was Aquinas' view at all based in history and reality in the West, or is that just a total innovation on his part?
Well, this is going beyond what my studies would bring to bear.
We're on a tangent. We're on a tangent. I understand
on this, but I'll say this briefly. I think what Aquinas was trying to systematize were the economic allowances that existed and St. Hippolytus and the Didache. Not that he was even aware of it, because probably both the sources weren't available to him, but they would have been part of the consciousness of Christendom. But what Aquinas most certainly did not intend was that theology would become the practical theology of the West. He still thought everyone was going to be doing baptism by immersion. He was just trying to come up with some theological rationale why baptism by pouring, when it was by necessity, was still efficacious. And so in some respects, it's sort of like, yes, Thomas Aquinas systematized it, but my opinion was like, he really isn't to blame because that wasn't his intention. So in a sense, it was a further development after Aquinas.
Well, he didn't make the distinction, really, did he, between acrivia and economia?
No,
that didn't even exist, really.
But he was against baptism by pouring and considered it sinful. So it's kind of ironic when there's modern Orthodox that are more liberal on this issue than Thomas Aquinas.
It is ironic.
But that is beyond.
Yeah, that's beyond the scope. Okay, let's come back to another. We were also looking at the formula of Hormisdas.
Hormisdas.
Okay.
Which I don't know.
And that's something I see. I see that bantered around quite a bit. I'm not very familiar with it. So why don't you tell us a little about that?
Yeah. So, like, in short, speaking apologetics brain and not historian brain, like the formula Hormisdas is kind of like the winner proof text to prove first millennium, papal infallibility and papal supremacy. And read according to those presuppositions, it would seem consistent, but read historically, it couldn't be farther from the truth, in all honesty. It's actually a kind of not so exciting document when read historically, but you have to address it because historians have addressed it quite similarly, particularly the Anglicans. Now, the purpose of the document was for people to, one, dump the Hinatikon, which is a Miaphysite compromise document. I wouldn't say it was strictly monophysite because it condemned Eutyches, but it was meant to kind of bring the monophysites and the Chalcedonians into the same page. So it's like this kind of ecumenist document proto-ecumenist document of the 5th and 6th century. Now, 2, the formula Hormisdas was supposed to get people to accept Chalcedon. And 3, it was supposed to get people to reject bishops who accepted the Hinatikon. There's a whole subterfuge behind this because there was popes like Pope Anastasius II. I hope I'm not getting his name because there was an Emperor Anastasius at the exact same time. So if he was the second, my apologies. But there's a Pope Anastasius who went into communion with the Bishop of Thessalonica, and the Bishop of Thessalonica was in communion with the Monophysites. Right? So this was a policy that the next Pope, Gelasius, and Hormisdas was from the same clique of people that came from Gelasius. In fact, Hormisdas was one of like the deacons for Gelasius. He was against this, right? He was against this policy of Pope Anastasius. And so the formula Hormisdas was supposed to get people to reject the bishops who accepted the Hinatikon. Because why? Because otherwise then you get tangential communion, right? Like, what good is being Chalcedonian, but you're in communion with the heretic? So Hormisdas' view was, well, we can't have that because in a sense, then we're accepting the heresy. Well, even with that conviction, which is very understandable, Hormisdas compromised the third part, right? Like, I don't ever see apologists talking about this. I don't even see really anyone other than men's really talking about this. But the reality is Hormisdas compromised the third part. And he accepted just the first 2 parts, dumping Hinatikon, accepting Chalcedon. As long as the documents subscribed, and the documents that the people subscribed to, rather, did not have to exactly match the formula. How do we know this, right? So, like, they're using this proof text saying, oh, this proof text proves papal supremacy, papal infallibility, but it's not about those things, number one. And number 2, it's not the document most people signed anyway. We know this because Hormisdas' letter 80 explicitly states the bishops can sign a similar document provided it was in a similar tenor as the formula. All right, so we already see Hormisdas says they don't have to sign the same thing. That's not me saying it. This is in Hormisdas' own epistle. An additional epistle, this is Lectio Avellana 139. It's actually one of these altered formulas. So it's not like we don't know what they said. We actually have one, right? And we know what it says. And it restates things very similar to the formula in a similar tenor, just like Hormisdas talks about. And it explicitly states in the Latin, all right? The English translation, you could get it online, that's personally available, actually obscures this. So this book is the first one that actually will clearly put into English what the Latin actually renders and doesn't render confusing. So you can see this very clearly. And I want to give thanks to John Colarafi, who turned me onto this in the PL. That Roman messengers, these are legates. It's translated angels in the English translation, but it's just in the Latin, it's the word messengers. It's not talking about angels from heaven bringing the formula Hermistus. That's ridiculous. So that Roman messengers accepted the letter 139, which had, to quote the letter, the power of formulas, such as the power of Hermistus. So we actually see, if you read the Latin, it's translated in the book, you actually have a altered formula claiming it has the power of a formula and dictates it is given to the Roman legates. So there's no doubt this is one of the altered formulas. It says so, and it shows you how it got back to Rome through the legates. So it's not a conspiracy theory that the formula was never adopted by all by all in the verbiage that Roman Catholic apologists frequently cite. It's a documented fact that altered formula existed and they were accepted by Rome because we have it's just not debatable. It's only obscured by bad translations. Now, as for the formula itself, it concerned itself not with papal claims, but on issues pertaining to the Hinaticon. There's nothing specifically wrong with the actual formula properly understood, in my opinion. So the question is, why did they alter it? And this is where the Anglican apologists, in making the defense that a lot of the Orthodox apologists like to quote, are wrong. Because the fact of the matter is, it was not altered due to papal claims because both Rome and the East didn't recognize anything written there to be really serious papal claims. The fact it was altered was because no one understood said claims to be literal or important. They just saw them as honorific. So they made an honorific, and in CA 139, they wrote honorific back. But they didn't make the exact same honorific because they didn't see it as like something that had a quote ad verbatim, as if it were actually important. And this shows that the issue really was, which is why these altered formulas were allowed, was the acceptance of Chalcedon and the dumping of the Hinaticon. That was the actual issue. And I know of no other book with English translations of these letters, or that due to these translations shows you why this formula was altered, what the importance of it was. And so if this kind of letdown go, wow, that's not that exciting. It's not that exciting because at the end of the day, the Formula Hermistus wasn't an outrageous document. It was just a kind of reunion document. That's why it was penned. And the real outrageous part, which was the anathematization of those who accepted the Hinaticon, was the part that was actually compromised, because it was considered just too much of a humiliation for a lot of these Eastern localities who were venerating these people as saints. And so essentially, Hermistus said, all right, you can venerate them, whatever, just accept Chalcedon. And that's pretty much the formula Hermistus.
Very good. Okay. So let's go to the next one. Ecumenical Patriarchate controversy.
Well, what's the context behind this? Pope Gregory the Great was being forced to garrison Rome against the Lombards, but he also had to pay the Lombards tribute. And he was being cut out of decision-making processes in a lot of local areas in the Balkans, which he would have been rightfully the patriarch. And this was thanks to Eastern Roman law. I use the term Byzantine in the book, but just so people are aware, no one called themselves Byzantine. It's just like, I just want to say Eastern Rome. It sort of got too confusing. But Eastern Roman law gave Justiana Prima ecclesiastical autonomy. And so these were like pretty much all these things moving against Rome at this time, which they didn't like. So at this time, Rome had already objected to the title Ecumenical Patriarch. He's not the first pope to bring it up, but Gregory was the first to actually excommunicate over it. And excommunications were considered local affairs and not universal. When Gregory cited that his predecessor failed to receive the portion of a council that bestowed the title Ecumenical Patriarch to Constantinople, he did so citing that other patriarchates, such as Ravenna, also have what we could call today line item vetoes, meaning like they could not accept certain portion of councils, but accept the rest of them. All right. And so, like Ravenna, for example, according to Gregory, did not accept Cyril's third letter to Nestorius, which is ironic because Pope Vigilius did a few decades previously. So this kind of shows you just because a Pope accepts something doesn't mean all the West was going to automatically accept it. The fact that it's actually positively cited by Gregory as proof that patriarchs have the right to not accept things shows you what he was doing he didn't feel was exceptional. Right. So this is a thing like a lot of Orthodox apologists and historical treatments will speak of the ecumenical patriarch controversy, but then like a Roman apologist may cite that, well, we have these papal sounding statements from Pope Gregory, and then he saw himself as exceptional, and that's out of context. He did not see himself as exceptional. And this is a very obvious example of that. He, in passing, makes a lot of statements during this controversy, which are very important to our study of ecclesiology. Now, for example, he claimed that the apostles, including Peter, were heads of particular communities delineating local jurisdictions, in contradiction to an ecumenical patriarch, which by virtue of the title would have jurisdiction everywhere. So he pretty much says, we just have local jurisdiction because everyone just has local jurisdiction. He sees this as sort of non-controversial. It's controversial now because of papal presuppositions, but it would have not been controversial in its day. Now, elsewhere, Pope Gregory speaks of there being no universal apostle, and for this reason, there cannot be a universal bishop. So this sort of idea that all that matters is St. Peter was rejected by St. Gregory the Great, because the idea would be, if that were even possible, then you could have an ecumenical bishop, and he's the bishop of everything, and he rejected that. Other things that are relevant, I've heard people say that, the term patriarch is not, it's falsely ascribed to Rome, but Gregory identifies himself as a patriarch, so there's nothing wrong with saying he's the Pope was the patriarch of the West, because Pope Gregory identifies himself as a patriarch. Another thing is he claims that the episcopate would become invalid if there's a universal bishop, because the idea is if the universal bishop errs, then the whole church errs, and that's not possible. So it's kind of this unconscious rejection of papal infallibility, almost treating like it's such a ridiculous idea. How could he conceive such a thing? Not so much that he was thinking it was a real idea that really existed, because this whole ecumenical patriarch controversy is kind of this tempest in a teapot. For example, the Pope of Alexandria wrote to Pope Gregory and called him Universal Pope, and he said, "You can't call yourself Universal Pope because then you deprive yourself of what you are," right? So, like, essentially, the Pope of Alexandria was kind of making fun of him for making such a big deal, which is why he bestowed the title back on him. So it's sort of like this war of words that he's making too much over. Now, he called other instances of the Pope being given such titles as empty honorifics, which is interesting, and that the Pope did not assume the title upon himself. And interestingly, the controversy stopped each time Pope Gregory received payments. You get, like, if you read the epistles, because there's so many in his registry, you'll get like him complaining about ecumenical patriarch, then he gets money, and then the complaints stop. It happens more than once. It's very interesting. In fact, at the one point after receiving a payment, Pope Gregory complained about the title Ecumenical Patriarch, but he says, "It was not worth my time," to quote him, "to excommunicate it over it anymore." So as a side note, my point in bringing this up is not to call Rome greedy. I don't think Pope Gregory was greedy at all. Rome was going broke. They were going to be invaded by Lombards unless they paid them off and paid off the soldiers. So, like, he essentially had to pull whatever strings he could to get the money he needed to get done what he needed to get done. But what point could we draw that's important is that practical political and economic considerations inspired this controversy and the war of words that followed. And in so doing, Pope Gregory voluntarily revealed his own understanding of ecclesiology, which is completely consistent with the earlier ecclesiology of the church, East and West, but inconsistent with these later second millennium ideas that people will try to impose upon these first millennium sources. Now, there's a couple other things I think that are worth also bringing up that are not part of the ecumenical patriarch controversy. For example, Pope Gregory spoke that papal vicars, as he calls them, required the unanimous consent of the whole council who elected them and the will of the prince. So papal vicars weren't considered like people that were unilaterally appointed by the Pope. They were people that needed the consent of their own synod to appoint them. And why is this relevant? Because this shows why a papal vicar like Stephen Adora could not just be replaced by the Pope like Pope Martin, right? He needed the unanimous consent of the whole council. So once you unpack all this 7th century and late 6th century details, you realize like these kind of ad hoc reinterpretations that papal apologists may attempt make no sense. They make no sense historically. Another interesting thing is when we'll read historians, and this includes Anglicans, they'll talk about a pope invalidating an episcopal consecration somewhere, and that it sounds like, because it's loaded language, the pope has like this unilateral power to make people non-bishops, just to depose them at will. But what's Pope Gregory actually say? He says that invalid episcopal elections are due to such elections not having the voluntary consent of all. So the whole papal eisegetical interpretation that you'll see even like Protestant historians give is something that's from Roman Catholicism in the second millennium. It's not in the first millennium sources. This ecclesiology of consensus is actually what is found in the source. That someone's invalid because they didn't have the voluntary consent of all. That's not some sort of reinvention I came up with. That's what's in the sources. So why haven't I heard this before, you might ask yourself? Well, it's because most treatments focus on a few letters in the controversy. They don't look at the entirety of his corpus, as this book does. And if one reads beyond the controversy, one can see the importance of consent to Gregory and also his awareness of Rome's canonical privileges, namely from Sardica. And this is something that comes up a lot since Carthage 419, the council. So Pope Gregory the Great is just a man of his time. And I think when you read him holistically, that's what comes out.
Very good. And then we have, I think you mentioned the Latin, you talk about the Latin Minutes of Nicaea too? Is that part of your, or is that something different?
Definitely. And this is going to sound too detailed.
First of all, let's unpack. What are we talking about? The Latin Minutes. We have got people who are not versed in these terminology. Nicaea 2 is what?
Well, let's talk about that. So ecumenical councils often have minutes in both languages. They were conducted in Greek and only later were translated to Latin. So like the Council of Chalcedon was in Greek, and even though Latin was still the official language of government in the Eastern Roman Empire as well as the Western Roman Empire, it wasn't translated until 100 years later. Because I guess the idea was if you were learned enough to care about these ecumenical councils, you would know Greek. and that's how these documents were. So just using common sense, Father, a council is conducted in Greek. Which minutes do you think are more likely on the face of them to be what was really stated at the council, the Greek or the Latin?
The Greek, of course.
The Greek, right? I mean, the Greek would have to have fundamental, profound problems, right? To consider that the translation of the other language is more likely what was said in the council that was conducted in the language of Greek, right? It would have to have very profound problems. Now, during Nicaea II in its second session, there's two letters from Pope Adrian I, one to the emperors and the other to St. Teresius of Constantinople. Now, in these letters are found certain papal statements in both the Greek and Latin. Now, the statements in the Greek conform to all sorts of stuff we see in first millennium sources. However, the statements in the Latin don't conform with what we see in the first millennium. They're actually very different, and I argue outrageously so. And so it demands a kind of like explanation. Well, why all of a sudden during Nicaea II are these different? And I would say that it's a matter of moral certainty that the Latin was not read out at Nicaea II. So the mainstream scholarly opinion is after the fall of the Byzantine papacy, Rome became its own state under Frankish protection. And that's when the donation of Constantine came out, and all of a sudden Rome started like pumping itself up, right, in the late 8th century. This is the mainstream opinion. I'm going to argue it actually starts a little later than that. But that's the mainstream opinion. And so when you read all scholarship up until the year 2017, right? So it's like Sachensky's book, and you go back I don't want to get his name wrong. Well, anyway, you get into Luth's book, and you get into Macaron, and you go into other scholars. Up until 2017, all scholarship, other than one person, said that the Greek is what was read out during Nicaea II. All the outrageous stuff was in the Latin, because the Latin was something that was in-house, but not something that would have worked in the East. And that's essentially the argument they make, that there were diplomatic edits, and they were edited out. But in recent years, so in the last 6 years, or 5 years even, Roman Catholic apologists have seized upon the scholarship of Dr. Eric Lambers. And Lambers' argument, and he is the collator of the critical edition of Nicaea II, so he is the authority that's alive today on this question. You can't take that away from him. His argument is that the Latin minutes, which have been preserved for us by Anastasius the librarian, because he translated them from Greek into Latin, faithfully did so. And that's called a retroversion. A retroversion is when you take something that was originally in Greek and then translated, originally Latin that was translated in Greek, and then you translate it back into Latin, or just whatever different languages. So supposedly, according to Lambers, Anastasius retroverted all these papal statements from the Greek, not from the Latin. And so, because they were in the Greek, according to Lambers, they're not in any of our Greek manuscripts, it's a textual critical argument, this means what was in the Latin today was read out during Nicaea II. And so that's what you hear from Eric Ybarra, Michael Lofton, because they need this to be in Nicaea II, because they're otherwise really don't have sources that state what they need for their later Vatican I ideas. But here's why, and it's the first time ever, it's in the book, but first time on YouTube, why without a doubt this argument is false. And I'm going to make this clear because it's kind of hidden in a footnote, because I just didn't want to get to this much detail in the book, but it is discussed. In the Collectio Britannica, we have several statements from these letters that I was just talking about from Nicaea II preserved in the Latin. Now, as I discussed, retroversion is the translation of something back into the language it was originally written in. So in this case, the letter to the emperors in Nicaea II, their second session, was originally written in Latin in the year 785. It was then translated to Greek during Nicaea II in 787, and then back into Latin by Anastasius the librarian, the Nicaea II's Latin translator, in 873, or by 873. One would expect that a retroversion's Latin would not be identical to the original Latin because it was translated twice. I mean, just use your common sense. I don't know, Father. Have you ever taken something to English, translating to Greek, and then someone asks you on the fly to say it in English, and it's going to come out a little different?
Yeah, of course.
Right. I mean, it's anyone who speaks two languages, but because we're in America, that's very few people that are born here anyway, speak two languages. They're not used to that, but anyone that speaks more than one language, that's super common. Like, I see this with my wife because she speaks Kamayan, Spanish, and English. It's anyone who speaks multiple language, that's just common sense. And so, of course, historians understand this when they're looking at retroversions. Now, that's why it shouldn't surprise us when we look at the Collectio Britannica, it's quotations from the pro-icon passages in that letter to the emperors. Their Latin is markedly different than Anastasius' translation of the same passages. So if you translate them, it's saying the same stuff, but it's just using different Latin words because it's a retroversion. I mean, like we just established, that's super common with retroversions. So here is the slam dunk. The papal passages are ad verbatim the same between the Collectio Britannica and Anastasius' translation. I'm going to repeat this. The papal passages aren't different Latin. They're ad verbatim the same between the Collecta Britannica and Anastasius translation. And just so people don't get like all nitty gritty, this will be in future research I'll publish, God willing, that like you could read 10 lines between one and the other, and it's not until the 10th line you got one word that's different. That's totally unlike a legitimate lecture version. In fact, this is 100% irrefutable proof that they were not retroverted from the Greek. It's literally impossible. No one could get that lucky as a translator. All right. So this means they were never read out in Greek. So Dr. Lambert's living authority in Nicaea II, with all due respect, is incorrect. And the majority scholarly opinion that the Greek is what was read out during Nicaea II is vindicated. Because what the Collecta Britannica preserves is signs of retroversion for the non-papal passages, but for the papal passages, there is zero sign of retroversion. And why is that? Is because the Latin was something that was sourced directly from either the original Latin, and it was never in the Greek, or the papal registry was modified by Anastasius. Those are the only two possibilities. What is impossible, it was retroverted from the Greek, because there's zero signs of retroversion. Now, I want to add to this argument, because we vindicated the majority scholars versus Lambert's, and sadly, Father Richard Price, who quotes Lambert's argument, and that's what's in the Nicaea II that people will buy off the shelf today. But like I said, it's literally impossible. That was in the Greek. That's just impossible due to how retroversions work. But I'm going to make the additional argument that the Latin was forged. Now, unlike the absolute moral certainty we can have about the retroversion, this is a matter of high probability weighing historical evidence. Let me give you that evidence. In short, if you read Pope's letter to the emperors during Nicaea II, it has an attribution for every author it quotes, including the popes. It quotes a lot of people, and it always gives you the name of who it quotes. Now, suddenly, towards the end of the letter, where a bunch of unprecedented papal claims that Roman Catholic apologists like to quote appear, it contains uncited quotations and paraphrases from 5 papal documents. So I'm going to repeat this. Whole letter, and it's very long. It's not a short, it's like 30 pages long. In a whole letter, when it quotes someone, it always cites who it's quoting. Then only in the very end, where all this suspect papal stuff happens, 5 times it quotes papal letters. But it doesn't give you an attribution. All right? So someone's going to wonder, well, why is that even important? Well, let me ask you a question, Father. Do you want to guess which other set of Latin documents from the mid-9th century used uncited quotations and paraphrases that were used to concoct invented papal prerogatives, and mainstream scholarship accepts this for like more than a century now?
The pseudo, what are they called?
It's adorning decretals.
Yes. Yes.
So all of a sudden, the hallmarks, the pseudo-adorning decretals, find themselves only at the end of this letter and only in the section where the papal stuff is. What are the chances of that if it wasn't the same method of forgery from the same era being applied to that specific section? Right? So that's something that scholarship has not pointed out. My research has pointed out. And people are aware of this method of forgery, but no one's ever looked at the critical edition of Nicaea II and go, wait a second. This critical edition reveals that if I apply this same interpretive methodology from the pseudo-Isidorian decretals to this letter in Nicaea II, that it reveals forgery in Nicaea II. So that's what I do. I simply take the same accepted historical methodology and using the critical edition Nicaea II to show the forgeries in Nicaea II. Now, it's only been the last 6 years or so that the methodology of the decretal's creation has really become solidified, thanks to Eric Knibbs and Dr. Evangelos Chrysos. So it's not that I'm a genius. It's sort of like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, historically speaking, that kind of did that hard work. All I had to do was apply what they've researched to the critical edition of Nicaea II. Now, the same passage also has an anachronism in it, which is
one question. Are there manuscripts that don't have that?
The Greek ones don't have it. None of the Greek ones have it.
Nicaea II. It all has
it's only the Latin manuscripts, and the Latin all comes from Anastasius the librarian.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
Right? And the parts that he tampered with have zero sign of retroversion. And the parts that he didn't tamper with, which he translated, all have signs of retroversion. So, like, you could even see the fingerprints of what he did if you're looking at this textually. So, in short, this is proof that at this section, an interpolation was made into the Latin with papal sounding words in order to make the invented section sound authentic. I mean, that's why they would quote papal correspondence but not cite it, because the idea was to make it sound real. All right. And the fact that there's no citation, I think, leads us to believe that we either have to trust Anastasius that he snuck in the original Latin, just didn't tell us, or more likely he was trying to hide a clumsy interpolation. There's a lot of guys that like to laugh and try to say I'm, and saying outrageous things, but there was a French scholar, and this is something actually John Colorati turned me on to 100 years ago, that made similar arguments that I'm making now, but he lacked a critical edition and he lacked the Collectio Britannica. So he just speculated that these things are possible, but he couldn't prove it. Well, I went ahead and proved it. That's the difference. So it's not like I'm the first person to even think it up. I'm the first person to connect the dots and demonstrate it. And that's in this book. And that's why it's so important for your readers. And so, I mean, more can be said about Anastasius, like we were referring to before. He's a known user of forgeries. He quoted the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals 40 times to St. Photius and to the emperor. He was an alleged conspirator in the murder of Pope Adrian II's family. He was an anti-pope. He took credit for writing almost all the Pope Nicholas and Adrian II's correspondence. So he's not exactly a trustworthy guy. He's a known forger. He's a political operator. But I won't get into more details on this at this point because, unlike the other stuff, scholarship has covered Anastasius pretty well on these points. I just sort of wish that scholars like Dr. Lambers and Father Richard Price maybe took a little more seriously Anastasius' character. It's kind of interesting how uncritically they accept what he does when the rest of everything scholarship acknowledges about Anastasius is that he's just not trustworthy. I think a more critical eye needs to be applied to anything he's written. And what I demonstrate in the final chapter, when quoting the Dictatus Papae, mainstream scholarship will say, well, the Hildebrandine reforms, the Dictatus Papae, that was when the papacy was changed. But almost everything other than the deposition of kings, right, which is so bizarre, what's that have to do with Christianity? Everything else in the document has a precedent in Anastasius the librarian, but no precedent before Anastasius the librarian. How does that happen? So people could laugh all day about it, but how does it happen? Well, it's kind of hard to see until, like this book, you lay out century after century after century, and then suddenly in the mid-9th century, that all starts to appear.
So basically, there's a total break with the past, and so we have an Orthodox papacy up until what, the 1850s, and then we start to see this innovation of a new papacy, 60s, 70s. Yeah,
until around the year 860, there was an Orthodox papacy. Now, there were sinful popes, just like there were sinful bishops of Constantinople, sinful popes of Alexandria. Of course, there's always been sin and corruption in the church. Even the apostles were dealing with that in their own day. They were pretenders pretending to be accomplices of St. James in Jerusalem. So it's this is something that exists even in Scripture. So yes, there's always problems, but ecclesiastically, the papacy was Orthodox until it was reinvented by Anastasius in his writings in the 860s and 870s.
Here's the question, though. Wasn't there still a struggle going on even after Anastasius to maintain continuity? Was Anastasius did he just dominate, and then from that point forward, there was no diversion from his reinvention? Or was there a struggle going on, like Romanity was still trying to live there in spite of the rise of a new form of the papacy, and I suppose under political pressure from other political sources, I would guess later on.
Yes, that's a good question. There was only very little resistance, and it was from Pope John VIII who canned Anastasius from his job, at least initially. Anastasius was.
Forgive me. Is he the same pope that accepted the Eighth Ecumenical Council.
Absolutely, and not coincidentally.
Not
Probably because
coincidentally.
Anastasius would have been against it.
Not coincidentally. Yeah, interesting. That actually goes to show again that Anastasius was inventing and working against the conciliar Orthodox papacy.
Now, the reason I draw this out is because it kind of dovetails into the Filioque controversy. And maybe I need to get more details in this, but the long story short is Pope John VIII would accept, like I discussed, the Frankish theologians being heretics in the Filioque, but Anastasius gave a very different defense of the Filioque. So it shows a difference in tact. If Anastasius was still writing for John VIII at that juncture, my guess would be that he would have used Anastasius' tact. So the idea that John VIII was willing to accept Photius, unlike Anastasius, and was willing to admit the Filioque was problematic, unlike Anastasius. It shows a difference, a slight friction. But even John VIII had certain pretensions, which were pretty highfalutin. And after John VIII, it does seem that the canonical understanding, and when I say canonical understanding, the way that Rome accepted ecumenical councils and interpreted canons, they kind of reverted to this kind of Anastasian view, who was Anastasius the first person to write about, for example, canons only being enforced in as much as the Pope of Rome accepts them. I mean, that's something that you wouldn't see before. Like Pope Gelasius spoke about economia, that you could loosen canons for economic reasons and for temporary periods of time. This idea that you could have canons not enforced at the goodwill of the Pope of Rome is something new with Anastasius, and that's something that took over really during even after John VIII. But even John VIII was sympathetic to this sort of thinking.
That's interesting. So nobody after John VIII, even though they never, until after the schism, they did not revert and back to the Robert Council of 69. They were still maintaining the Eighth Ecumenical Council even until after the schism. So that's why I thought there was still a Roman, remnant fighting against the new papacy and the Franks and the other political powers that were trying to.
Because they accepted the Eighth Council, they accepted its canons. There's no doubt about this. And in a weird sense, it was really Anastasius' distorted view of how you could accept the canon that kind of made it more tolerable than it would have otherwise been. But like without Anastasius' reinvention of ecumenicity, how do you accept the canons of the council, but then not like do something about the Filioque? Because the council makes it impossible to put the Filioque in the creed. So clearly, this kind of gets, I don't want to get too much into this at the moment, it's in the book, but Anastasius said councils are accepted in as much up to the canons and as much as a Pope of Rome accepts something for, religion's sake, meaning faith and morals is what people will say in modern parlance. And so it could have been argued that the part about the Filioque was disciplinary and not about faith and morals. But this whole way of thinking only began with Anastasius. No one, earlier popes of Rome, including John VIII, Pope Leo III, said it was impossible to alter the creed because they didn't see this idea that you could just apply faith and morals and just accept that part of a council and not the rest of it. You got to accept the whole ecumenical council according to the consciousness of the Orthodox East and Orthodox West up until Anastasius. The fact that John VIII says that it was impossible for him to accept the creed shows a kind of disjuncture with Anastasius' thinking, which is why I said the only friction was really with John VIII. But after that point, you have to think about Anastasius would have been the operator behind the papacy pretty much since the year 855, right? And so John VIII dies in 882. So it's almost 30 years of Anastasian captivity over the Roman Church.
When does Anastasius repose again?
Well, we don't exactly know. There's debates over years. Some people will claim he died in 877. But not really based on anything. It's just when he lost his job. Federico Montanaro claims he continued writing for John VIII and disappears from the scene when John VIII dies. I'm more sympathetic to that view, not only because it's the most recent academic view, but you could kind of see some, I'd say, flourishes of Anastasius, I think, in papal correspondence. So he wasn't maybe the official papal librarian anymore, but he might have still been used as a secretary of sorts. And, he just took the demotion, I'm guessing. But we're not exactly sure when he died.
Okay. So what other, we have an Orthodox papacy, and how can we differentiate that from post-Anastasios papacy?
Well, that's a good question. The Orthodox papacy always conformed to the same patriarchal ecclesiology of everyone else. For example, St. Cyril, but also the Council of Ephesus wrote that they recognized St. Pope Celestine's excommunications as implicating only the West, right? So, this is not like some minority opinion. It's literally the official correspondence of the council. The papacy, the Orthodox papacy, never made claims to direct jurisdiction fallibility. In fact, in offhand comments, it denied such things. The documented existence of direct jurisdiction and papal infallibility and these sort of changes about ecumenicity and epistemology I was referring to, they all appear in the mid-9th century. They're all from Anastasius' pen or in the Suda Isidorian Decretals. But it should be pointed out that the Suda Isidorian Decretals were kind of these documents were only relevant in France until they were internationally popularized by Anastasius the librarian. So pretty much he is the cause of it all, either indirectly or directly, in fact. And this is not my opinion. This is mainstream fact.
So if they believed in consensus, the Orthodox papacy practiced consensus, why and how did they start getting these accepting things like the Filioque, which were never accepted by the consensus of the church?
I mean, that's a good question. And I would say all heresies begin with good intentions, right? So it was a slow death, I would say. Maybe someone came up with the term, meant one thing from it, and then over time people forgot that was its meaning, and then it gets this wrong meaning. Now, leaving aside how orthodox Augustine was and some Western saints were or were not on this question, let me just go by the official party line, right? Because people are going to debate, left and right, what did Augustine really mean, or some of these other saints really mean. But the point is, what was the official party line in Rome to the east? And that official party line was that the Filioque conceptually was the same as the Eastern view of the Father being the sole cause of the Holy Spirit. For example, when St. Maximus addressed the question of a pope using the Filioque, it was the one before Pope Martin, I'm forgetting his name, Theodore, I think. His defense was that the West meant the same thing as the East. They saw the Father as the sole cause of the Spirit. So this is a very interesting defense if you think about it, because the official party line he's giving from Rome, because that's where Maximus is at the time, is that, they use the Filioque, but they don't mean anything wrong by it. They don't mean anything different from us by it. Now, this official party line, even 2 centuries later, when St. Photius had Pope Nicholas deposed over the Filioque in 867, Anastasius defended it, quoting Maximus, right? So he's giving the same opinion. And the quote Anastasius, "We do not claim that the Son is cause or principle of the Holy Spirit as they suppose." I'm going to repeat. This is the official party line from Rome in the 860s or 870s. I don't know the exact year this was written. I'm going to guess 860s. "We do not claim that the Son is cause or principle of the Holy Spirit as they suppose." And he calls this interpretation doubtless. Right? So he takes this for granted, or at least this is how he's framing it. It's without doubt that we do not claim what now the Roman Catholic Church claims. So when you ask, for example, if they all believed in consensus, how did the West start getting doctrines like the Filioque? Well, the official party line was the Filioque was the Eastern doctrine. It was just another way of saying it. Now, this doesn't come up very often in, I guess, modern East-West debates on the topic, but I'm quoting people from Rome speaking for the Pope, Maximus spoke for the Pope. Anastasius spoke for the Pope. And I just read what he wrote. He was claiming they weren't making another claim. Now, I do think that especially Anastasius was being disingenuous. We know that in the previous century that the Franks took issue with a statement from Tiresias of Constantinople, where he said that the Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son, and their issue was it wasn't double procession, the idea that the Spirit has two principles. And just so people aware, the official Roman definition doesn't accept two principles. It accepts two principles from a single principle, but that just means two principles, right? So let's cut around the cake a little bit and just say the Frankish theologians wanted there to be two principles. And Anastasius must have been aware of this, but he just wanted a winning argument with the East so that way they couldn't depose Nicholas. And so the official party line of Rome was, we don't accept double procession. And that's why I think when John VIII called it heretical, it wasn't this massive pivot for Rome. Rome didn't confess the Filioque until 1014. And the official party line for centuries was whenever they did hear it, what they meant by it was simply the economic procession, that the Spirit proceeds from the Son temporarily to us believers, not in an eternal hypostatic causal sense.
Did they speak like that in defense of it? Because that's kind of an Orthodox interpretation of what they're saying, isn't it?
I think so, because when Pope Adrian I wrote back to the Frankish theologians, when he quoted the Filioque back to them, he only used quotations which spoke of the temporal procession. So I think there had to be an intention behind that. And again, we just read right from Anastasius. Writing 100 years later, we cannot claim that the Son is cause.
What's so curious is that in the official dialogue, even for the last 50 years, this is the point where at least Orthodox theologians I've spoken to, they said they don't get it in the West. They don't get it. This is an economic and only economic. In other words, in time and space, Pentecost. It's the only way you can think of any procession from the Son, and this distinction. And I think, if I remember correctly, in some of the things I've seen from Scott Hahn and others, they don't get that. To this day, they don't get that. So they are ignorant of these claims that you're referring to, or they just ignore them.
The papalist way of thinking ultimately is not very historical. And what I mean by that is because they'll just say, well, Anastasius is not infallible. Maximus is not infallible, right? But that's not how we do history, right? Like, I'm approaching this historically. So I go, there is a official statement, an official stand to take on this issue. It's these documents. And that official stand is, we believe the same thing. We don't believe this is causal. Now, you could say they're liars, they're wrong, they're whatever, but that was the official stand at the time. That was the stand they were taking. And the other stand they were taking was that, like Leo III said, the Filioque may be sung in teaching and be taught by being sung, but neither by writing nor by singing may be unlawfully inserted into that which is forbidden us to touch. Right? So, meaning you can't add it to the creed. This is something a Pope wrote in the early 9th century. Pope John VIII wrote, "We know the unfavorable accounts that you have heard," he's writing the Photius, "concerning us in our church. I therefore wish to explain myself to you, even before you write to me on the subject. You are not ignorant that your envoy, in discussing the creed with us, found that we preserved it as we originally received it, without adding to or taking anything from it. For we know that severe punishment he would deserve who should dare to tamper with it." So my point in emphasizing that is, right, the Pope doesn't view himself above the council. Either Pope Leo III or here, Pope John VIII. They're saying, like, they would be under condemnation if they were to change it. That's their point. He continues, "Nevertheless, I think that your holiness, so full of wisdom, is aware of the difficulty of making our bishops share this opinion, and of changing at once so important a practice which has taken root for so many years. We therefore believe it is best not to force anyone to abandon that addition to the creed, but we must act with moderation and prudence, little by little, exhorting them to renounce that blasphemy." Now, ultimately, this view of John VIII has proved not to be correct, right? Like, this sort of, we'll condemn it, but we'll let them take it away with time, didn't end up working. But I want to make two comments, because some people say, well, this is not an authentic letter of John VIII. Well, one, this comes from the Latin. So the sort of conspiracy theory that the Greek was made and then the Latin was made from the Greek, and the Latin's all falsified because Photius apparently has superpowers. That's just ridiculous. But let me make another very obvious point. If the Greeks were to falsify John VIII's statement, what they wouldn't do is take that latter tact, because actually the Eighth Council doesn't allow you to give this sort of, what's it say? Not to force anyone to abandon the creed. It anathematizes anyone who adds to the creed. So if this was a falsified statement from from Saint Photius Chancery that was then translated into Latin, it would never have this latter statement. It has all the hallmarks of authenticity. And so, to me, this demonstrates Pope did not view himself above councils, and he viewed the Filioque of the Franks to be heretical. That's what's legitimately in this, and has none of the hallmarks of forgery.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Very, very revealing. Let me ask you this in this context. Are we going to get into this at the upcoming conference that we're going to be having? This particular aspect that you just talked about?
I was hoping someone else would.
Okay.
I'm just not really my topic, but we will make sure it's covered somehow. There's enough of our brains. We'll do it.
Yeah. Speaking of the conference, this is what we've got. Everybody who is interested, they can go over to uncutmountainpress.com, right to the events page, and we have the. I'm not sure if this is going to come up. If I put that on the screen, that doesn't come up. We have the brochure there. You can read all about it. We have right now 5 speakers. There may be additions to that. We'll see, 1 or 2 perhaps. Still thinking about some more. We have a flyer, brochure, schedules. We have the video you can watch. And right now until Sunday, we're offering, the Uncut Mountain Press is offering a $35 discount. Whoever wants to sign up and go to the conference, register for the 3-day conference, $35 discount for everybody. And it's at this beautiful, beautiful location. I think we need to actually show at some point here before we get too much further. I want to show the actual trailer so everybody can can see the trailer as well. But let's keep going in terms of where we're at. I don't want to get you off track here. This is fascinating. So Anastasios sometime before, or no, sometime around Constantinople IV. When we say Constantinople IV, we mean the Eighth Oecumenical Council in 879. And they're talking about, well, at least Pope John VIII is talking about what you just read, that this is a heresy. How did the West abandon not only, unfortunately, the Orthodox position on the Filioque eventually, that's a different issue, but a consensus? Why did they abandon consensus, and how? How maybe is more the question.
Yeah,
which is key, right? Which is key to the fall. Like that's why we're talking about the fall of the papacy. That's the key. They abandoned consensus. Absolutely. They fall away from it.
That's why we had to identify at the beginning what the ecclesiology was, because how do you even evaluate how something rises and falls if you don't know the cause of the fall, right? And so it's this abandonment of the ecclesiology of the West and East, which is that of consensus, of conciliarity. Now, sadly, through the ecclesiology of Anastasius, from his speculations and forgeries, its permeation is what causes that fall. And I think the political opportunism, which existed everywhere, but that gave the fertile soil to continue with the sort of Anastasian program, is what causes it. So, like after John VIII is killed, Rome, though accepting the canons of Constantinople IV, did not accept. I'm sorry.
I had just some interruption. Forgive me. Restate the last sentence. There was some noise. Go ahead.
Okay. So anyway, like in short, sadly, through the ecclesiological speculations, forgeries, Anastasius, the permeation of these leads to the abandonment of consensus-based ecclesiology in the West. After Pope John VIII was killed, Rome, through accepting the canons of Constantinople IV, did not accept its chief purpose, and that was the recognition of Photius' consecration as patriarch. And I kind of referred this before. The next two popes after John VIII called Photius a mere layman. And this is kind of insane, right? You just signed the Ecumenical Council. We have the reception letter of Pope John VIII. There's no doubt it's an authentic letter. And so and he explicitly accepts Photius' consecration in it. And then you have the next two popes saying, it doesn't matter, that's what the Ecumenical Council said. We don't accept it anymore. It almost makes no sense from the Orthodox worldview, but remember the Anastasian worldview. It's not about faith and morals, right? It's just it's a matter of discipline whether we accept someone's ordination or not. And so that is fallible, and that could be discarded. So we kind of see like the Anastasian view of ecumenicity gets picked up because the next two popes don't like Photius. And it just all goes downhill after there. This idea, by the way, comes from Anastasius' letter to John the Deacon in 874. So we actually know exactly when it started. We have a letter and a date for it. Now,
some of the critics might say, you really have made Anastasius into not only a villain, but a brilliant man. People sat at the foot of him, and he just, was commanding people from behind the scenes, and it's almost like a conspiracy theory. How could you answer that?
Well, I'd say the real string puller probably was King Louis, and Anastasius was his man pretty much. So the Frankish emperor, right? It's like Rome's under the protection of the Eastern Frankish emperor. So it kind of makes sense that, that guy has power, right? Because he's the king of all Italy, right? So Anastasius was pretty much his picked man. He was the man who King Louis picked as pope. So we know he's connected to the hip because of that. And he's the man that King Louis used as his own legate for the next 2 decades, when he was trying to bargain political marriages and stuff. So we know his connection to King Louis, and we already know that through force of arms, King Louis could decide popes. So that's not a conspiracy. But here are the two proofs which I think are decisive. One, Anastasius himself says he wrote almost all the correspondence of Pope Nicholas and of Pope Adrian II. Why is this relevant? Well, because from when he wrote that statement in 871, Anastasius was, how do I say this? He wasn't in Rome for most of Adrian II's papacy, Adrian II's papacy. Why? Because he was involved in the conspiracy that killed his family. So think about this. How did he write most of the Pope's correspondence when he was kicked out of Rome after being involved in killing his family? Well, it's because, in reality, even not being in Rome, all those papers had to go past Anastasius' desk. You got to have a lot of power to make that happen. Now, more so, how does Anastasius ever get let back into Rome and get his job back and a promotion? He gets his title of the librarian after he comes back to Rome, after the whole murder conspiracy. So the fact he ever had, as the book says, he ever had his job while Adrian II was still alive, shows you that King Louis had more of a say over who the Pope lets back in Rome than the Pope did. There could be no doubt about that. Because how does someone who murders your family get back into the city? Come on. It's sometimes I just don't think historians use their common sense when they try to kind of minimize Anastasius' role. He was a pope. He was writing correspondence when he wasn't even in the city of Rome. He was acting as a Roman legate and preserving all the minutes of Constantinople 869-870 before he was officially let back. He gets his job back despite being part of a conspiracy. It's because he was the string puller. I think it's pretty simple.
All right. So he is also toying. You were about to go and say when I asked you that, you're about to go into some further detail about
the abandonment of consensus. In short, Anastasius in his letter to John the Deacon claims that an ecumenical council, as like I said before, is only authoritative as much as the canons and the decree are accepted by the Pope of Rome and touch in matters of religion, faith, and morals. And in making this claim, Anastasius butchers quotes from Popes Gelasius and Greg the Great, which said the exact opposite. And it's ironic when there's Orthodox apologists which will claim we only accept the canons and the decrees, essentially about faith and morals. And that's the Roman Catholic view, and it's the Roman Catholic view from Anastasius. It's not from popes like, earlier popes, like Pope Gelasius wrote, if it, and he's speaking of Chalcedon, is partially redeemable, it is no longer possible to stand firm in its entirety. Right? If it's partially redeemable, it's not longer possible to stand firm in its entirety. His point is the whole ecumenical council must be accepted, or otherwise none of it could be accepted. This has been called derisively conciliar fundamentalism, but it's really more of just a conciliar contextualism. You can't have the fathers of a council making a correct decree and making binding canons, but also be utter fools about other matters and accepting the let's say the communion of heretics and things like that.
Besides the fact that if you go that route, then it's chaos, it's anarchy, right? Because then every local church will say, well, I accept this part, I accept that part, and then you're not going to have a point of unity at the end of the day.
Essentially, like you could have local churches like Rome did not accept individual canons, but that wouldn't remove the force of the canon, and it wouldn't remove the force of the council. It would just show that particular church is just not going to allow it. They're not receiving that part of the council. But to actually say a part of the council is in error, like let's say what the Universalists will say in the condemnations of Origen in session 5 and session 8 of Constantinople II, they'll say, well, that was not on faith and morals. So that's not what the council is about. This has been very far from the thinking of any of the contemporaries of the time, because the idea would be, well, if we can pick and choose what's authoritative in the council, then the whole council falls apart.
Yes.
So, and that's why I don't think it's very coincidental that ultimately the parts of councils that kind of lacked local acceptance for certain periods of time, for example, like Canon 28 in the West, or the third letter of Cyril to Nestorius, all eventually get full reception, because it's just you're fighting against the authorities of the council itself when you do that. It just doesn't work long term. Now, in order to justify these unilateral papal actions against the consensus of the church, Anastasius devised and Rome adopted a new epistemology of what was known to be true. Like I said before, this whole faith and morals thing. And by the time the Hildebrandian reforms in the 11th century, and this is where most mainstream scholars identify the origin of the medieval papacy, everything there is not brand new to the 11th century. It's from the 9th century. And I just want to list one example that's in the book. There is one statement that's quoted as soon as during the Creedals that is found from a 6th century forgery called the Galatian Decree. It's the only thing I've been able to find in the first millennium that precedes the 9th century that says something that would be totally out of step with the consensus ecclesiology of the church. And so, I mean, there you have it.
How do you spell that?
The Galatian Decree.
Gelasian, G-E-L-A-S?
L-A-S-I-A-N. Galatian Decree. So, in short, the Orthodox papacy, by deliberately abandoning consensus, depended upon a precedent from Anastasius for reasons acting unilaterally against the consensus of the church. And they needed this because it was a way in the 11th century to deal with the investor controversy and ultimately the Crusades, right? That way, now you could appoint bishops wherever you want in absentia, set up a second altar in the city, because all that matters is the Pope. But that idea did not exist before Anastasius. It's a brand new idea and something that Anastasius devised to deal with St. Photius and disputed jurisdiction in the Balkans. And sometimes people don't want to think such a time-honored institution could have a pretty worldly and basic origin, but it does.
Well, on the screen right now, I have I think the last reference in the book to this Galatian Decretum. And you see the screen? Can you see the screen?
It's too small for me to read, so you can read it.
I can make it bigger. I can make it bigger. We can go this way. How about that?
Right there. Quoting the Dictatus Papae, the Roman Church was founded solely by God, It's found in the Galatian Decretum and Anastasius Virgin of JE 2448, where only the Pope can be rightly called universal. Was the operating assumption? All right, there you go. So that is what it states there. And just so people are aware, as Christos research, I think from this year, so it's very new research, brings this out. The Galatian Decree was attained by Anastasius by reading the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. That's where they were preserved. Mm-hmm. Just for people with apologist brain, if they want to go, well, the existence of the Decretal shows the existence of papal supremacy. That same Galatian Decree is quoted by the Carolingian books against Pope Adrian I. And if you want anything in the first millennium that calls into question the infallibility of a pope and the non-existence of direct jurisdiction in the West, it's the Carolingian books. So it shows you they understood it honorifically and not seriously. But Anastasius applied it seriously. So that's why really it's an Anastasian invention.
So basically the Orthodox papacy, by deliberately abandoning consensus, in other words, the end of the Orthodox papacy came by abandoning consensus. It was from Anastasius and his political ambitions for the papacy for himself. That's the origin of. Is there a more ideological origin, or is it just ambition for power?
No, you have to think about this very basically. If let's just say another religion, if I said there was a mullah in Iran and he's infallible and any fatwa he gives will have no errors, you go, well, that's a very silly idea that there's a human being that could give infallible fatwas, right? But it's because it's the Pope and we have 1,000 years ingrained history where this idea is mainstreamed. It doesn't sound ridiculous, but it is a ridiculous idea. We would never accept this idea about anyone else on earth other than the Pope of Rome. Now, that doesn't make it on its face false, but if historically speaking, if it's something kind of out there, you kind of wonder, well, how does something out there just come up? Where does it come from? And what you find is it was devised as a way of dealing with being outmaneuvered in the Balkans. And so Rome needed direct jurisdiction because they were going to get the Balkans back through political means. They needed infallibility because they weren't going to otherwise deal with the things in the ecumenical councils that made them secondary. So these are all things that were come up by Anastasius in order to make Rome above the church. And the reason the Eastern Franks were on board with this doesn't mean all the Franks, they kind of get lumped together. But the reason why the Eastern Franks are on board with this is specifically because if you make the church centered in a city that you control, it gives you more power. They can't control the consensus of the church. It's outside their empire. Even the Byzantine Empire at that time didn't control Alexandria, didn't control Jerusalem. They weren't part of the Eastern Roman Empire at that time, right? So like the consensus ecclesiology doesn't work if you're a Franks and you want everything under your thumb. So these things are devised for a way for them to project power.
Does this vindicate somebody like Romanides?
I have never read Romanides, so I don't know.
Well, he certainly says that Roman Orthodoxy existed, and it was lost to the Church of Rome because of the Franks and the essentially taking over the papacy, over time, but definitely by the 11th century. So sounds like what you're saying, very close to what you're saying. That I don't know how original or pathfinding his research was. Maybe he was relying on other historians, but in the Orthodox Greek world, it was definitely out of nowhere, because I don't think there'd been any work done in the Greek language on those sources. So it was revelatory for a lot of people in the Greek Orthodox world. Of course, he's writing in English in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when he's bringing all this out. But were historians talking about this, what you're talking about, and what Romanians talking about? Were they talking about this in the West? Was it there, but just not mainstream? Or is this even that was just not ever considered a possibility?
Yeah, my impression is most historians have focused on the Hildebrandian reforms as being the like you even get that from like Protestants like I think his name's Leroy Froome in the 1950s and others. They were well aware of that because it is sort of night and day there. Um, the stuff with the Franks specifically, I think, had more to do with intuition because the Filioque, and people know the Franks fought, let's say, Pope Adrian the First of the Filioque and whatnot. But this book really doesn't get into the Filioque issue because the Filioque was really ancillary to like the actual debates over jurisdiction and ecclesiastical prerogatives, which were the meat of the vying for power, right? Like, because we read from Anastasius, like, yeah, we're down the Filioque, right? And we read from John the, we're not down the Filioque, but neither were taking the position they were against the East. So this kind of indicates that Frankish contamination of doctrine via the Filioque wasn't what created the real rift. What created the rift, in my view, is the lack of consensus, the lack of appreciation for consensus-based ecclesiology. And it's because of that they were able to later take something to Filioque and be like, we accept it, and so that's what it is, because we're infallible, and what we say goes, and it's essentially above councils. But you can't get to there unless you've already had the ecclesiastical defects, which exist starting with Anastasius.
Yeah. I think it seems to me not very historical on the part of. I mean, you said that people just kind of thought it all began in the middle of the 11th century, but nothing just popped out of nowhere. There's a whole prehistory, and what's always been strange to me, and not being a specialist at all or an historian, but just looking at some basic milestones from the 9th to the 11th century. Obviously, the Eighth Oecumenical Council is key. Obviously, this period is key. I mean, Dvorak and others have shown that in some of their research, but there's a mythology out there among many Orthodox even that well, there was an anathema exchange in 1054, but that really didn't mean schism, and schism was slow. It's a process over hundreds of years, blah blah blah, as if it just comes out of nowhere. There's like 1054 just has no prehistory, and as if there's not. I mean, the Orthodox response only makes sense if you understand that there was a shared faith that they walked away from, that they didn't have to convene a council to condemn because they were self-condemned, walking away from a council they had previously accepted. That seems to be the Orthodox, response was almost immediately there was baptisms of, well, that's for other reasons, but there was immediately a sense that this is a departure because they had an ecumenical council which had condemned what they were doing. Right? And so it puts, your history and the history and the prehistory before the schism is really important for the Orthodox to put everything in historical context and understand how important this period is. St. Photius on one hand, and then Anastasius the Librarian on the other. It seems to be so decisive for the future.
It is amazing that the church was on a precipice during St. Photius's patriarchate, and he tried his best to hold the line and keep the church together. And sadly, Anastasius and ideas really tore it apart.
Yeah. So I want to show the audience before we close out and open up for any questions we have. I want to show the audience the two trailers for the book and the conference. And then we'll come back, and you guys, if you have questions, you can start writing them down in the chat, whatever the platform is that people are following us on. I think we're receiving from Facebook and YouTube. And then we've got also Crowdcast. Okay, so this is the trailer for the conference, and then we'll go get the trailer for the book in a second. All right, so let's see this.
The year is 879 AD. The place, Constant.
Wait a minute, 1 second. Gotta redo it because there's no sound. I've got it muted. Okay.
I hear it just fine.
The year is 879 AD. The place, Constantinople, the queen of cities. Under the dome of Hagia Sophia gather more than 400 bishops, representatives from all 5 patriarchates, including Rome. This is the Ecumenical Council that united East and West. This is the Ecumenical Council that confirmed all in the one faith. This is the Ecumenical Council you have never heard of, but holds the key to unity. This is the Eighth Ecumenical Council and the Catholic condemnation of the Filioque. This spring, join faithful from across America who are gathering to pray, be inspired, and be instructed in the faith of the indivisible Church. With the blessing of His Grace, Bishop Longin of the Diocese of Neagra-Chanice, under the tutelage of churchmen from Greece, Europe, and America, and in the stunningly beautiful retreat of Lake Guntersville, participants will enjoy the blessedness of brethren dwelling together in unity. For the first time in English, the divine service for the Eighth Ecumenical Council will be chanted during an Athonite-style 6-hour vigil. Another first will be the publication of the translation of the minutes of the Council. And spring break makes it ideal for families to come, with an abundance of outdoor activities for the kids. March 14th to 16th, Lake Guntersville, Alabama. We await you to share with you in the joy of the peace and power of God, the truth of our faith.
So that is for the council, for the conference coming up. I hope people can join us. It's going to be phenomenal. And now let's look at the
Perhaps no single institution commands the devotion of more believers than the papacy. Many believe the Pope of Rome possesses an infallible authority instituted by the Lord Jesus Christ himself. But is this indeed the case? Engaging for scholars and laymen alike, The Rise and Fall of the Papacy is a groundbreaking analysis of the origin and ecclesiastical transformation of the pre-schism Church of Rome. Century by century, author Craig Truglia combs through an array of sources spanning the entire first millennium, including the Talmud, Holy Scriptures, ecumenical councils, and new translations of papal correspondence. Uncovering the jurisdictional subterfuge of the Easter controversy, the untold story of the Church of Rome reforming Pope Stephen's sacramentology, the depositions and anathematization of popes, and much more, one discovers the macro-historical importance of Anastasius, the librarian. Once shrouded in mystery, this backroom actor rises from the status of laicized cleric to anti-pope, and finally, to the puppet master behind the most influential papal chanceries of the 9th century. Due to this one man's extensive work, the papacy was reinvented, and Western Christianity has never been the same since.
All right, so there you go. There is both of those are, I think, got rid of it. There we go. Hang on. Yeah, both of those are fantastic, I think, for people to get a taste of what's being offered. I'm looking forward to the council. I think by the time we arrive at the council, a lot of people have read your book. They're going to come with some really interesting and insights, questions. It's going to be a very creative atmosphere. This is something that maybe I need to talk a little bit about, just to give prehistory. Why is this council so important? Why is this conference so important for us today? Going back a couple of decades in Greece, there's been a concerted effort on the part of leading ecclesiastical men like Metropolitan Orthodox Vlachos or Father George Metalinos or Father Theodore Zisis or other academics, Father John Romanides before them, to impress upon the Orthodox today the need to officially and formally and clearly, universally, for the Orthodox to recognize the Eighth and Ninth Ecumenical Councils. That would be the Eighth we just talked about under Photius, St. Photius, and the Ninth during the times of St. Gregory Palamas. They're different historical events and contexts, but both of them have been accepted by the conscience of the Church in terms of the dogmatic and ecclesiastical, phronema and decisions have been totally accepted. And this is a very apparent, especially with the Ninth Ecumenical. We have the commemoration of St. Gregory Palamas on the second Sunday of Great Lent, and all of theology has been embraced. And so it's extremely important for the Church to in our day to reaffirm what's been accepted. People say, Father Peter, what's this Eighth Ecumenical Council? I thought there were 7. I even had a priest respond and say, Father, there's only 7 ecumenical councils. What are you talking about? I said, brothers and sisters, what happened in the last 100 years is a mystery to me, but we have many examples of conciliar and patriarchal confirmations of the ecumenical nature of this council under Photius, St. Photius the Great in 879. We have it in the council that reversed and undid the false council of Florence. We have it referred to by for instance, the letter of the patriarchs in response to the Pope when they commemorate the Eighth Ecumenical Council. Not at all an accident. They're pointing to the Pope to essentially the faith that he once held, or his predecessors once held, a millennium earlier. And so the Church has, in the most official way, said this is an ecumenical council. Why today there's gross ignorance on the part of the Orthodox? We're not teaching it. We're not communicating it to our people. We're not learning that ourselves in our seminaries. Is a mystery to me. I think it's one of the things we'll discuss in Alabama, and it'll be fascinating to see what we can discover. Go ahead. You want to say something?
Yeah, what will fix it, Father, is that 6-hour vigil, because to the average person, it doesn't matter that an official conciliar statement in 1848 identifies Constantinople IV as the Eighth Ecumenical Council. What's important is whether they liturgically commemorate it, right? What's the feast day for the Eighth Ecumenical Council? And so what this requires an organic veneration among the people to be doing this, the vigil service that, like, let's say, was going to be done for the first time in English language during this conference. So I think it's very important to be part of history and to be part of this.
That's a fantastic point. Yes. When we pray, the way we pray, that is what we believe, right? The lex, or how is it? Lex orenda, lex credende. Do I say it Latin correctly?
I don't know. I use help with my Latin translations.
the famous saying, yes. So we're going to do the vigil. We're going to chant the service, and that is a big part of, the ecclesiastical and liturgical confirmation of the faith of the Church in the prayer. So that's going to be phenomenal. That's going to be really important. The vigil is going to be a key to the whole conference, but. So you'll be speaking on leading up to the council, the Eighth Ecumenical, and then
pretty much the papal subterfuge surrounding the councils, mostly before, but also would touch on afterwards.
That'll be very good. We'll have another speaker talk about the minutes of the council and what it shows us in terms of the place and the understanding of the Pope in the life of the Church. We'll have another speak about the Filioque per se. We'll have another speak about St. Photius and his theology. I think it'll be very well rounded, and there'll be plenty of time for discussion. We'll have 3 roundtable discussions and plenty of question and answer time, and several scholars from abroad as well who'll be joining us So it's going to be, I think, a real important event for the church in America. I don't think anybody's even thought about this much in America. I haven't heard many people talking about it, but hopefully this will begin a good discussion.
Yeah, the idea is to go, to learn, to talk, to worship, and then bring that back to your parish. Very important.
We have a question here from Brother Augustine, who's following with us. Good evening. Good to have you. I have spent hundreds of hours on church history, theology, ecclesiology, and had never once heard of Anastasius before you mentioned him. How was he able to hide so deeply?
That's a very good question. And I think the real reason is not an obvious one. It's we're reading church history like Protestants and Roman Catholics and not like Orthodox. What do I mean by that? I remember when I was weighing, becoming Orthodox, my impressions were simply the Orthodox ecclesiology is way more common than the Roman Catholic ecclesiology in the early church. So it's almost like popular vote. But when you see the sources and you look at them in isolation of presuppositions, or if you're to do so with Orthodox presuppositions, either way, you don't look at it papally. What happens is you realize there's just no Roman Catholic view of ecclesiology at all in the first millennium. It just doesn't exist. And so then all of a sudden you're like, all right, well, it's just not here. When's it start appearing? And that's when it all of a sudden it's like everything's Anastasius, literally every single source. Like you're not even looking for it. And you'll find, oh wait, Anastasius wrote this, Anastasius wrote that, Anastasius translated this, Anastasius collated this. And it happens when you actually start looking for the origin of the Roman Catholic doctrine, you find Anastasius. Because
that's something they would not have done. They would not have done that. It would have been either intentionally off the radar or just not even questioned. They're not asking the question, so the answers are not coming.
Yeah, because they're asking, when they ask the question, what was the early ecclesiology of the church? They're usually asking the question wrong, because how you ask the question will affect your answer. So if someone asks the question, was the early ecclesiology of the church papal or Orthodox or Protestant? It's already wrong. You've already loaded the question. You have to go more basic. What was the early ecclesiology of the church? And then you shed away all those presuppositions. And then you just stick with that question and only try to answer that question. Not was it papal or not, right? You don't insert foreign ideas into it. You just don't find those foreign ideas because they weren't there. And then when you get to the point where this doesn't look like the early ecclesiology of the church, this looks totally different. Wait a second, this looks very Roman Catholic. You don't even have to ask a question anymore. You start realizing this is different than everything else I've read for centuries, and it's all connected to Anastasius. And then you just realize it's because he's the one behind pretty much all of it. And it's very humbling, because I'll say this, Father, I don't subscribe to the great man theory of history, like from Nietzsche and stuff. There's a sort of temptation to want to find the single string puller or single conspiracy or whatever. And I actually don't buy into that stuff. But in this instance, we do just have a historical actor that's responsible for all the sources. And, it's possible there's things that have been lost to history that might add more to this, but I'm looking at this historically. And I have to go strictly with what the sources say, then you have to connect Anastasius to them because he's connected to all the sources.
All right, we're going to have two questions, then we're going to end it because we're really, it's a big, long stream tonight for us. At around 24 minutes, Craig references a video highlighting the difference between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Which video is this? Where can I find it? 24 minutes, Craig references a video highlighting the difference between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Do you remember this? I don't remember this.
I don't know. I don't remember a video, but it's your video, Father Peter, and it's simply just titled "Orthodoxy or Catholicism?" ? It's from the last week.
Oh, okay.
Very
okay, and I think that's an excerpt from
from one of your Q&As
or something like that. Okay, here's another thing. Craig, thank you, and may your work be blessed. In your contemporary research, do you see people leaving the Roman Church due to Francis? Curious as how the trad cats are defending him. So it's a little off topic, but interesting question.
The reality of secularism is leading to people leaving everything: Mormonism, mainline Protestantism, Orthodoxy, because we have our liberals, Roman Catholicism. So I don't get too involved with saying, well, their terrible bishop is so terrible, because we got our own terrible bishops. That's the reality. And I think, yes, will we have some Roman Catholics become Orthodox because of it? Yeah, sure. And will they look into these questions? Yeah, sure. But the average Roman Catholic really doesn't care that much about the Pope, in my opinion. That's more like a thing people that are obsessive about things, that like the average Roman Catholic cares about, like divorce and stuff like that. So I don't think it's going to have as big as effect that people think.
We had one question earlier, which I can't find right now, but it's basically, I'm a Mormon. Would this be a good book for me to read? I think that was the question.
Well,
you want to answer
actually, I'd say yes. I would take special pride with Mormons, atheists, Muslims, anyone just interested in history, because I think this is a good history book. You don't have to be invested in the question theologically to get something out of this. And so this was written to address historical question and give an honest historical answer. I also feel that, like, whether you're Oriental Orthodox or you're Protestant, and you might start yawning once you get into the later centuries, because it stops leaving the things they find entirely relevant. But the first few chapters of the book would be, I think, a real delight to them as well. I think it's something everyone should read.
All right. Fantastic. I think we covered it. Thank you very much for joining us. So coming up in the near future, we'll be having next Friday here in Orthodox Ethos, we'll be discussing a paper that we produced for Orthodox Ethos on Father Seraphim Rose and his understanding of reception and the so-called corrective baptism. That's next Friday, December 1st. We have our next installment on our analysis of the Book of Revelation on Tuesday coming up. Our regular question and answer session, which we live stream to Orthodox Ethos Crowdcast and YouTube membership, that's on Thursday. Hopefully we'll have more opportunities. I know you're going to be doing some stuff in the near future with some other YouTube Orthodox presenters. You want to say anything about that? Do you have any dates, or is it still to be decided?
No dates yet. I do have a show on a non-Orthodox channel on whether we're addressing papal history entirely wrong. It will be with the other Paul. I will be doing a response to Ancient Paths TV on Cairo Lucaris, and we'll be doing some stuff on St. Dionysius the Areopagite. We have someone who wants to defend the authenticity of his works, which is always interesting, a brand new defense of the authenticity of his works. So we'll be doing a lot of that. But yeah, it's what I'm looking for, and here, being that I'm a big platform father, is I'm looking for someone who's willing to debate this book with me. And I think I've been perfectly nice to people. What are they afraid of? I feel that this book has been written to address the question. It's not going to be out of date. I think it's going to affect the discourse. I think it's something anyone who's addressing this question will have to read. And the question is, will you stand up and debate for what you believe in vis-a-vis the Orthodox? I had one person who said, well, I'll think about it, but I want to read the book in advance, like to decide whether or not he'll debate it. Well, let me tell you this. If you really believe that a papal ecclesiology is historical, then there should be nothing to be afraid of. This is something where I feel the evidence is so strongly on the Orthodox side that it's really, I debate anyone on the topic.
Well, I would love to see that. Let's see if they come to debate, and we'll support it, we'll promote it, and we'll see. Maybe, I don't know how, do they have debate platforms for that? I know that I've seen some of those going on, or is it just going to be on your show, your channel over there?
I don't know. The sky's the limit. Why not bring me on Pints with Aquinas or whatever? Doesn't matter. You name the time and place. Let's do it.
Yeah, and we'll support it as Uncut Mountain Press. Whatever we can do to support that, let it be blessed. I look forward to it. I think this book's gonna do really, really well. And between now and the conference, you're gonna sell. I don't know. I don't want to predict anything, but it's going to be one of our best sellers for sure. Anybody who's serious about Orthodoxy and they're in Catholicism, they're in Eastern Catholicism, whatever, and they're considering Orthodoxy, they've got to read this book. It's for the degree, 800 footnotes and a total thorough analysis of the first millennium. It seems to be that would be extremely interesting for anybody from that perspective. And many Orthodox need to read it because they need to know their faith. They need to be able to help their fellow man who's on their path to coming to Orthodoxy. They need to know their faith in terms of what is papalism and what is conciliarism, what is the Orthodox Church's teaching on these things. Really pertinent to our church life today because we have a resurgence of papalism. It's so ironic to me as the papacy is imploding before our eyes. We have in Orthodoxy a disintegration in some parts of the world, Orthodox world, toward a papalism. And it's interesting because I think behind all of the historical data and theology and ambition, ultimately any fall into delusion, heresy, or distortion is a spiritual question, right? You've given rights to the enemy, you've fallen into worldliness, you're not working against the passions and cultivating the virtues. And so in an age like this, where it's extreme secularism, the spirit of Antichrist is palpable, it's behind. I think that's behind any kind of slouching toward papalism on the death of papalism in many ways. We're seeing that before our eyes. So bizarre, but not surprising. And that's
and more Orthodox read this book, that tendency would be avoided. I think we would have the lived-in experience of the church, which would obviously reinforce just anything intellectual. Because
I was thinking that if you read this book and then you read Father Seraphim Rose's Orthodox Survival Course, which is part 2, right? It explains the millennium after the schism in many ways, what happened after the schism. This gives us a read up into the schism. That would be, those 2 books together would be very fascinating to read. And then the other thing that would be really interesting is a spiritual analysis of the West, the spiritual life, monasticism, what was going on in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries in terms of the spiritual life in the West. I think I don't know what you could find historically. I don't know what, what's possible, but my gut feeling is that would be very revealing as how do we end up with a Anastasios who's running the show in Rome? There's something even deeper there, behind him, going back maybe a generation or even a century or 2.
Definitely. There's always a spiritual cause, ultimately.
Yes. All right. We're going to call it. Thank you so much. Wonderful to have you. Let me get us back to normal here. And I hope everybody goes over there and goes to Uncut Mountain Press and buys a book and joins us for the conference. UncutMountainPress.com.
Sign up for the conference, buy the books, and get something to read on the plane.
There you go. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Patrick. It's been a joy, and I think very educational for everybody.
Thank you, Father. It's been great.
All right. God bless everybody. We'll see you.
Exulimat larissa